For thousands of years, cats have walked beside human civilization like quiet shadows. They guarded the first grain stores, crossed seas on ancient ships, entered temples, homes, myths, and empires, and somehow never lost the wild mystery in their eyes. From prehistoric hunters to the companions curled beside us today, their story is far older, stranger, and more powerful than most people realize. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because tonight we follow the complete history of cats, from their ancient origins to the modern world. Long before the cat becomes a household presence, before it curls on woven mats in mud brick homes or slips through torchlight in temple courtyards, it exists as a flicker in the grass, a movement so slight it barely seems real, a pair of eyes catching the last light at the edge of a marsh, a body low to the ground, all patience and tension, all calculation and nerve. The story of cats begins there, not in comfort and not in affection, but in danger. It begins in a world full of larger mouths, colder nights, harsher seasons, and constant competition, where survival belongs to the animal that wastes nothing. The cat enters history late, but it enters life's deeper story much earlier, shaped by millions of years of selection into something narrow, precise, and extraordinarily hard to improve upon. In the age before villages, before granaries, before any human hand ever reaches out to stroke a small striped back, the ancestors of cats are already learning the discipline that defines them. They are not built like wolves, who endure by cooperation and pursuit across open ground. They are not built like bears, who can overwhelm with size and force. They are not generalists in the easy sense. They belong to a lineage that narrows itself into an art. Short bursts of speed instead of long chases, ambush instead of endurance, solitude instead of social complexity, flesh instead of almost anything else. In the long balance of evolution, this is a risky choice. Specialization brings elegance, but it also brings vulnerability. When the world changes, specialists often disappear first. What is remarkable about the cat lineage is not only that it becomes specialized, but that it survives repeated planetary upheaval while keeping so much of that original design intact. To understand where the history of cats truly begins, it helps to step back beyond the domestic cat, beyond even the recognizable wild cats of Africa and Eurasia, into the older branch of carnivorous mammals from which all modern cats eventually emerge. The earliest roots lie in a time after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, when mammals begin to diversify into ecological roles that had once been closed to them. Among these early carnivorous mammals are forms that are not yet true cats, but which occupy the evolutionary ground from which later feline predators will arise. The fossil record from these deep stretches of time remains incomplete, and scholars still debate some of the finer branching relationships among ancient carnivores. But what survives in the record suggests a gradual sharpening of body plans towards speed, stealth, and killing precision. By the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, tens of millions of years ago, the world is greener in many regions than it will later become. Forests spread widely. Warm climates dominate large areas of the globe. In this environment, early carnivoran groups diversify into different strategies. Some become more dog-like in habit and anatomy. Others move in the direction of hypercarnivory, feeding heavily or almost entirely on meat. Within this broad evolutionary theatre, the ancestors of cats begin to separate themselves from other predatory mammals. This is not yet the house cat in any recognizable sense. and it is certainly not the neat family of modern felines as people imagine it today. But the underlying features are taking shape: shortened faces, powerful jaws, limbs tuned for sudden acceleration, flexible spines, claws suited for grasping prey, sensory systems increasingly adapted for detecting vulnerable movement in low light. One of the strange things about cat evolution is how conservative it eventually becomes. Many animal lineages experiment wildly, branching into forms that look almost unrelated to one another. Cats do branch, and some ancient cat relatives become enormous, imposing predators with exaggerated canine teeth and muscular builds. Others remain smaller, lighter, and more discreet. Yet even across this diversity, there is a recurring commitment to a certain template. A cat is not an inventor by evolutionary standard. It is a refiner. The body is tuned again and again toward the same solution: get close without being detected, strike with speed, hold with claws, kill efficiently, eat nutrient-dense flesh, and retreat. It is a design so effective that once established, it changes less than one might expect over immense stretches of time. The popular imagination tends to leap quickly to saber-toothed predators when thinking about ancient cats, and it is true that these dramatic forms occupy an important place in feline prehistory. But they are also misleading if treated as the main story. The saber-toothed cats, and the various cat-like predators often grouped around them, represent only one branch of a broader and more complex tale. Some of these animals are not direct ancestors of the domestic cat at all. They are evolutionary experiments, formidable and successful in their own time, but ultimately dead ends. Their fossils capture public attention because they are spectacular. The quieter line matters more to the future. The smaller, subtler cats, the ones whose descendants will persist through climatic swings and geographic changes, matter because they carry forward the particular balance of traits that later makes coexistence with humans possible. As the Miocene unfolds, roughly 23 to 5 million years ago, climates begin shifting in ways that reshape habitats across Africa, Eurasia, and beyond. Forests retreat in some areas, grasslands spread, seasons strengthen, landscapes become more varied and, in many regions, less forgiving. For predators, this is both problem and opportunity. Prey species change, cover changes, competition changes. The cat lineage responds not by abandoning its essential strategy, but by diversifying within it. Some cats become larger and more powerful, built to tackle substantial prey. Others remain small, specializing in birds, rodents, reptiles, and whatever vulnerable life can be taken with minimum risk. That small cat path is the one that matters most for our story. It is the path of restraint, of low energy expenditure, of precision over force. It creates an animal that can survive on relatively little, move almost invisibly, and occupy edges that larger predators ignore. The ancestors of the modern small wildcat do not dominate headlines in paleontology the way mammoths or giant predators do, but they possess an advantage that history repeatedly rewards: flexibility at a modest scale. A large predator needs room, abundance, and a stable prey base. A small one can survive in scrubland, woodland margins, rocky steppe, riverbanks, and eventually in the disturbed ecologies around human beings. It does not need to conquer the landscape. It only needs pockets of shelter, a supply of small animals, and the ability to remain difficult to catch. This is one reason the cat lineage proves so durable. Its future does not depend on ruling the world. It depends on slipping through it. Somewhere within this wider evolutionary history emerges the ancestor most relevant to the domestic cat, the African wildcat, and closely related wildcat populations across parts of Africa and Western Asia. These animals do not yet live with humans, but they already possess the qualities that will make such a relationship possible. They are small enough to exist near larger creatures without attracting constant aggression. They're adaptable enough to exploit changing environments. They're wary by default, which means they can approach opportunity without surrendering caution. And they are solitary, which turns out to matter more than it first seems. Unlike pack animals, which require social integration and hierarchy, wildcats do not need a human group in order to function. They can remain themselves and still benefit from proximity. That peculiar balance, closeness without full submission, will shape the entire later history of cats. Before that future arrives, though, the world subjects these animals to repeated tests. Ice ages advance and retreat, rain belts shift, deserts expand and contract, rivers change course, grasslands open, close, and open again. In North Africa and the Near East, environmental conditions fluctuate across millennia in ways that repeatedly alter where both humans and animals can live. The evidence remains incomplete in many places, but archaeology and paleoclimate research together suggest that the zones where wildcats thrive are rarely static. They track prey, they follow cover, they endure marginal conditions. A creature built for patient ambush may seem delicate, but in evolutionary terms it is often tougher than it looks. It can wait, it can hide, it can survive on the edge of scarcity. There is a deeper irony here. The domestic cat will later appear to many people as ornamental, even frivolous, an animal of comfort and mood. Yet its foundation is laid in some of the harshest conditions imaginable for a small predator. Every feature that later seems charming is born as a tool. The soft footfall is not elegance for its own sake, but silence in lethal approach. The large eyes are not beauty alone, but low-light calculation. The whiskers are not decoration, but navigation through tight spaces, detecting the world at the scale of mouse tunnels, stone gaps, reed beds, and darkness, even play. That strange and familiar part of cat behavior reflects rehearsal. Young predators refine timing through mock combat and sudden pounces because missing the real strike later can mean hunger. Beneath the domestic surface, the old machinery is still there. Humans, meanwhile, are still far from the settled societies that will one day change the cat's fate. For most of prehistory, people are mobile hunters, foragers, fishers, and gatherers moving through seasonal landscapes. They encounter cats, surely, but only in passing. A glimpse near camp, tracks at dawn, eye shine beyond the fire. Perhaps a stolen scrap of meat, perhaps the remains of a bird taken neatly from a snare line. There's no reason yet for intimacy. No storehouses overflowing with grain, no permanent villages thick with mice, no dense human ecology generating regular opportunities for a small predator. The two species inhabit some of the same broad regions, but their worlds do not yet overlap in any deep or lasting way. And still, the conditions for that future are being assembled piece by piece by the late Pleistocene as anatomically modern humans spread across continents and increasingly modify landscapes through hunting, burning, gathering, and seasonal occupation. Ecosystems become more human-shaped even before agriculture begins. Animal behavior adjusts around this new and highly intelligent primate. Some species avoid people completely. Some are hunted to local disappearance. Some learn to exploit the traces humans leave behind. Cats, or at least the wild cats ancestral to domestic cats, seem to belong to that last category, though very cautiously at first. They do not seek partnership in the manner of future dogs. They do not rush toward dependence. What they have, instead, is a talent for noticing advantage without surrendering independence. That may be the most important inheritance in the entire history of cats. From the beginning, they are not shaped to obey, and not even especially shaped to cooperate. They are shaped to calculate. The cat lineage survives because it takes what is useful and resists what is dangerous. In evolutionary time, that habit becomes a kind of philosophy written into muscle and nerve. Stay hidden when possible. Spend energy carefully. Trust little. React fast. Keep your options open. When humans finally become worth approaching, the wildcat will do what its ancestors have been doing for ages. It will not step blindly into a new world. It will edge closer, remain ready to vanish, and learn the pattern before committing anything at all. So the first chapter of the cat's history is not really about domestication yet. It is about preparation, though no animal knows that it is preparing for history. It is about a lineage refined in silence across forests, scrublands, marsh edges, and dry country, tested by climate swings and ecological pressure until it becomes one of the most efficient small predators ever produced. It is about survival through restraint, about elegance born from necessity, about a creature that enters the human story already complete in the ways that matter most. By the time the first grain stores appear and the first mice gather in human settlements, the cat will not need to become something new. It will only need to recognize an opportunity. And because it is a cat, it will do so without haste, without ceremony, and without ever fully giving itself away. By the time the small wildcats of Africa and Western Asia begin moving through the margins of human awareness, they are already the product of an astonishing degree of biological refinement. Nothing about a cat is accidental. Even the stillness is engineered. A resting cat appears almost effortless, as though it has simply arranged itself into elegance, but the apparent ease conceals a body built under strict conditions. This is an animal designed not for spectacle but for efficiency, and the deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that the cat's future success depends less on domestication than on the extraordinary completeness of the predator that already exists before humans ever begin to tolerate it nearby. The cat does not win by strength alone. There are larger hunters almost everywhere in the ancient world. There are faster runners over long distances, more social hunters, more physically imposing carnivores, and more flexible omnivores. The cat's achievement lies elsewhere. It is one of nature's finest examples of focused design, a predator assembled around the narrow but highly effective task of noticing small life, approaching it undetected, striking at exactly the right moment, and finishing the matter quickly. That concentration shapes the entire animal, from the arrangement of its bones to the chemistry of its digestion. It also shapes its mind. What later generations of people interpret as aloofness, moodiness, or mystery often begins as something simpler and older intense sensory filtering, caution, and a low tolerance for wasted effort. Consider first the body itself. A cat is compact, but not crude. The spine is unusually flexible, allowing the animal to compress, extend, twist, and redirect its momentum in a fraction of a second. The shoulder girdle is loosely attached compared with that of many mammals, which increases stride length and agility. The limbs can absorb impact and release energy rapidly. The paws are soft where they need to be silent, yet armed with retractable claws that remain sharp because they are protected when not in use. This single feature tells an entire evolutionary story. Dogs blunt their claws against the ground because they chase and endure. Cats preserve theirs because they rely on a sudden grasp at the decisive instant. every piece of the design favors the ambush over the marathon. The head, too, reveals the same logic. The skull of a cat is comparatively short and rounded, reducing the length of the snout and bringing the bite force into a tight, powerful arrangement. The jaws are not made for chewing variety. They are made for piercing, holding, slicing. The teeth of a cat, especially the carnassials, are tools for shearing flesh with startling neatness. This is one reason cats remain such strict carnivores compared with many other familiar domestic animals. A dog can live, within limits, as a nutritional opportunist. A cat is far less forgiving. Its metabolism depends on nutrients found in animal tissue, including taurine and certain preformed vitamins that it cannot synthesize efficiently in the same ways other species can, even in modern homes, with food poured from tins and packets. The ancient truth remains: the cat is not merely fond of meat, it is built around it. That strictness makes the cat seem fragile in one sense, yet it also makes it formidable. A specialist can be ruthlessly effective within its chosen niche. Cats possess excellent binocular vision, especially useful for judging distance and close-range attacks. Their night vision is famous, though not magical. They do not see in complete darkness, but their eyes are highly adapted for low-light hunting, helped by a reflective layer behind the retina that improves sensitivity. Their pupils contract and widen dramatically, regulating light with remarkable efficiency. Their ears swivel independently, capturing faint sounds and triangulating movement. Their whiskers, often underestimated, act as tactile sensors that help them navigate confined spaces and interpret nearby objects and airflow. This is not simply an animal that sees prey. It feels the shape of possibility around it. The effect of all this is that a cat hunts at a scale humans often fail to appreciate. A lion impresses because its power is obvious. A small cat's brilliance can be missed because it operates in miniature. To stalk a mouse through grass, reeds, stones, or storage clutter is a problem of precision, not domination. The prey is quick, nervous, and often hidden. The hunter must detect motion that barely qualifies as movement, then advance without triggering escape. A cat's shoulders roll gently. Its feet place themselves with absurd care. Its head stabilizes, the entire body flowing forward in increments so controlled that even a dry leaf becomes a hazard to be calculated. Then, when distance closes to the final fraction, all caution converts into explosion. Few animals move from stillness to violence with such economy. Young cats begin practicing this almost immediately. What humans call play is often training disguised as exuberance, pouncing, grappling, biting, stalking moving shadows, ambushing siblings from behind cover, batting at objects that twitch or roll unexpectedly. All of it develops timing and coordination. The behavior looks charming because it occurs on a small scale and in familiar spaces, but its origin is severe. A predator that misses too often does not merely lose a game, it risks hunger. This is one of the quieter continuities in the history of cats. Across thousands of years and countless cultural changes, the domestic kitten on a woven rug or modern carpet rehearses movements whose deeper purpose was written long before houses existed. The cat's temperament is shaped by the same demands. Solitary hunting does not require the elaborate cooperative signaling of wolves, wild dogs, or many primates. It rewards concentration, self-reliance, and acute responsiveness to territory. Wild cats do not need a group to flush prey, corner large animals, or share defensive duties in a coordinated way. They must know their surroundings intimately and use them efficiently. As a result, cats tend to be highly aware of place. Boundaries matter. Scent matters. Roots matter. Cover matters. A cat is not merely in an environment, it is constantly mapping it. This helps explain why even domestic cats often remain so attached to familiar paths, lookout points, doorways, sleeping spots, and hidden retreats. Beneath the apparent fussiness lies an older territorial intelligence. Scent, in fact, is one of the least romantic but most important dimensions of feline life. Humans tend to think of cats as visual creatures because their eyes are so striking, but scent is fundamental to how they organize their world. They mark spaces, objects, and sometimes one another. They read chemical traces left behind by rivals, potential mates, or intruders. A place that looks unchanged to a human may feel entirely altered to a cat because its invisible informational layer has been disturbed. This is one reason the presence of other cats can produce such complicated responses, ranging from tolerance to tension to sudden violence. The solitary hunter is not antisocial in a simple sense, but it is highly attentive to the risks and opportunities posed by another predator operating nearby. That said, cats are not purely isolated by nature. This is a point often flattened by oversimplification. Many wildcat species are largely solitary, especially in their hunting behavior, but the social life of cats can be more flexible than popular stereotypes suggest. Under the right ecological conditions, particularly where food is concentrated and predictable, cats can tolerate one another to an extent that surprises people who imagine them as miniature tigers in permanent withdrawal. Domestic and semi-domestic cats form colonies. Mothers cooperate loosely under some circumstances, and individuals can develop stable social relationships. Scholars still debate exactly how much of this reflects inherited flexibility versus newer pressures created by human environments. But no single explanation fully accounts for the range of feline social behavior. The key point is that the cat's independence is real, yet not absolute. It is better understood as selective sociability. That selective quality later becomes central to domestication. But even before then it serves the animal well. A creature that can survive alone but occasionally tolerate others possesses options. It can defend territory when necessary. It can also cluster around abundant food without needing a rigid hierarchy. This capacity, modest though it may seem, helps explain why cats do not need to be transformed as radically as some other species in order to live near people. They already contain the behavioral seeds of coexistence, though on their own terms. Another feature of cats deserves attention because it affects both their survival in the wild and their appeal to humans' energy discipline. Cats are not built to squander effort. They sleep or rest for long periods because explosive hunting is metabolically expensive, and because an ambush predator gains little by constant movement. In the wild, needless activity exposes an animal to danger and drains reserves that may be essential later. This pattern survives domestication so completely that people sometimes mistake it for laziness. In truth, it is part of a tightly regulated economy of action. The cat saves itself for the meaningful moment. This restraint contributes to the strange impression many people have that cats are always withholding something, as if part of their life happens elsewhere. Beyond observation, in a sense, that is true. The cat's rhythm was never built around human expectations of attention or display. The voice of the cat is another interesting case. Wild cats vocalize, but generally not with the frequency or range that many domestic cats direct toward humans. Meowing between adult cats is limited compared with the constant vocal negotiation often seen in domestic settings. This suggests that some familiar cat behavior develops or intensifies specifically in relation to people. Yet even here, older foundations are visible. Cats can purr, hiss, yowl, spit, chirp, and produce varied calls linked to state, context, and relationship. They are more expressive than their reputation implies, but the expression is usually economical and situational. Like the rest of the animal, communication is used carefully. There's also the matter of size. It may seem obvious that cats are small, but their particular scale is one of the great advantages in their history. A small predator requires less food than a large one, can shelter in tighter spaces, can disappear more easily, and can live close to larger animals while attracting less hostility. It can exploit edge habitats, ruins, riverbanks, reed beds, storage areas, and eventually barns, alleys, courtyards, and ships. The domestic cat's ancestors do not need vast prey herds or remote wilderness. They need opportunity, cover, and enough room to operate. This makes them unusually compatible with human-altered environments long before anyone intentionally breeds them for companionship. What emerges from all this is a creature already astonishingly finished before the first true domestic chapter begins. The cat does not need humans to become a better hunter. It does not need them to sharpen its senses, redesign its gait, refine its patience, or teach it how to kill vermin. Those qualities are ancient. What humans eventually provide is not transformation at first, but context. A new landscape appears, not of forests and scrub, but of fields, grain stores, refuse, walls, warmth, and prey concentrated by settlement. The cat's body and mind are ready for that environment long before the environment itself exists. This is why the history of cats feels different from the history of many other domestic animals. The deeper one looks into feline anatomy and behavior, the less they appear as a species reshaped from the ground up by human intention. They appear instead as a predator that arrives nearly complete, carrying into the human world a design millions of years in the making. The soft tread, the narrowed focus, the coiled stillness, the fastidious appetite, the suspicion, the capacity for sudden tenderness without surrendering autonomy. All of it is already there. The domestic future of cats begins not with reinvention, but with recognition. Somewhere ahead, villages will thicken, grain will attract mice, and human beings will unknowingly build one of the finest habitats a small hunter could hope to find. When that moment comes, the cat will not need to change its nature. It will simply step into a niche that seems almost uncannily prepared for it. The change begins quietly. No royal decree announces it. No shepherd marks the day. No priest records the first meaningful approach of a wild cat to a human dwelling. The shift happens at the edge of a field, in the dark behind stored grain, in the narrow zone where human ambition creates exactly the kind of ecological disturbance that a small predator can read as opportunity. For most of human existence, people move through landscapes without producing the steady concentrations of food waste, shelter, and rodents that would make close coexistence with cats worthwhile. Then, in several parts of the world, but most importantly for this story in the Near East, the old rhythm begins to change. Camps become more durable, settlements hold longer, seeds are collected, then planted, then guarded. Grain ceases to be merely gathered and becomes something stored. And the moment human beings begin storing food in quantity, they begin, whether they intend to or not, feeding something else. The rise of agriculture is often told as a triumph of planning and control, a great step towards civilization. It is also the creation of an entirely new habitat. Fields of cereal crops attract seed-eating animals. Harvested grain, carried and piled in baskets, jars, pits, or storerooms, creates dense targets for theft. Mice and rats do not need an invitation to recognize abundance. They arrive because abundance is what they do best at finding. The first farmers are not merely growing food for themselves, they are generating one of the richest rodent ecologies the prehistoric world has yet seen. In doing so, they create the opening through which the cat enters history. This does not mean the first villagers set out to domesticate wildcats in the active, deliberate way that later humans breed horses or dogs or cattle. The evidence suggests something subtler. Scholars still debate the exact pace and pattern of cat domestication, but the mainstream view is that it begins as a process of self-domestication, or commensal adaptation. That is to say, wildcats are drawn toward human settlements because the settlements provide prey. Humans then tolerate, and perhaps gradually value, their presence because those same wildcats reduce the number of grain-raiding rodents. No single explanation fully accounts for every step in this transition, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the archaeological and genetic record strongly suggests a relationship built first on mutual advantage rather than command. The setting matters. The Fertile Crescent and adjacent regions, with their early agricultural communities, become crucial ground in this story. Here, as human groups shift from mobile foraging toward more settled farming lifeways, villages produce the layered ecological conditions cats can exploit. Mud brick walls create crevices, stored grain creates rodent pressure, refused deposits draw scavengers, human activity displaces some predators and concentrates smaller prey. A cautious wildcat moving at dusk along the margins of such a settlement would find something rare in nature, a hunting ground made denser by another species. This is not comfort yet, it is advantage. One of the most revealing archaeological finds in the history of cats comes not from Egypt, where cats later become iconic, but from Cyprus. There, at the Neolithic site of Shilura-Kambos, archaeologists uncovered a human burial associated with a cat dated to roughly 9,500 years ago. The animal appears to have been deliberately placed near the human body. This matters because Cyprus has no native wildcat population that could simply have wandered in from the mainland. If a cat is present on the island, people must have brought it there by boat. That alone suggests a relationship already more significant than accidental tolerance. The exact meaning remains debated. Was the cat a valued hunting companion, a symbolic animal, a semi-tamed settlement hunter, or something harder to classify? The evidence does not let us answer every question, but it does show that by the early Neolithic, cats are not merely haunting the edges of human life. In at least some cases, they are crossing water with people. That detail can be easy to miss, but it is profound. To transport a cat by sea in the Neolithic is to recognize its worth. The animal may not yet be domesticated in the full social and biological sense associated with later domestic forms, but it has become useful or meaningful enough to move with human communities into new territory. That suggests a partnership already underway, however loose. Unlike livestock, cats are not obvious transport assets. They do not provide meat, milk, traction, wool, or hides on a large scale. Their value must lie in something less visible yet deeply practical. They protect stores, they manage pests, they fit into village life without demanding much from it. This emerging relationship differs sharply from the one between humans and dogs. Dogs are drawn from wolves through a long process likely involving social integration, cooperation in hunting or guarding, and a more explicit place in human group structure. Cats take another route. They do not become pack members. They do not reorganize themselves around human leadership. What survives in the record suggests that early cats remain behaviorally close to their wild ancestors for a long time. This is one reason the domestic cat remains so genetically and behaviorally conservative compared with many other domestic animals. Humans do not remake the cat from scratch because they scarcely need to. The wild cat already possesses the relevant skill set. All that is required is an environment where its natural behavior produces benefits for both sides. The rodent question is central here. Grain losses in early farming communities are not minor annoyances. They threaten winter reserves, seed stock, and fragile food security. A settlement that cannot protect stored grain is vulnerable not only to hunger, but to repeated labor losses, because every stolen measure represents work already done in planting, harvesting, drying, and storage. A small predator able to patrol walls, storage spaces, and field edges becomes valuable very quickly. Even a modest reduction in rodent pressure would matter. What early villagers likely see is not a pet in the modern sense, but a useful presence, an animal that keeps to itself, costs little, and kills the right targets. Yet utility alone does not explain the whole transition. Plenty of animals exploit human settlements without becoming accepted. Some are trapped, poisoned, hunted, or driven off. The cat's success lies partly in its restraint. It does not usually approach humans in noisy flocks. It does not root through everything in sight like a pig. It does not threaten children in the way a larger carnivore might. It hunts mostly at the scale of nuisance life. It can disappear when unwelcome and reappear when useful. That makes tolerance easier. A cat can become familiar without becoming overwhelming. There is also the matter of human perception. Even in early stages, cats may have stood out among the creatures gathering around settlements because of their grace, cleanliness, and eerie competence. A dog's utility is obvious, but a cat's utility arrives with style. It hunts in near silence. It waits with impossible patience. It sees in the dim hours when human eyesight fails. It leaves behind small bodies as evidence of a job done. The first farmers may not have sentimentalized these qualities, but they almost certainly noticed them. And once an animal moves from tolerated to appreciated, other possibilities begin to open. A young cat spared, a litter left undisturbed near a wall, scraps tossed deliberately, a sleeping place informally accepted. Such acts leave little trace in archaeology, yet they may be the true daily mechanics of domestication. The process is likely uneven. Not every settlement tolerates cats equally. Not every wild cat adapts well to human proximity. Some remain too wary. Some settlements may prefer trapping rodents directly. Others may rely more heavily on other pest controllers. The spread of cat-human coexistence is probably patchy, local, and slow. This matters because domestication is often imagined as a clear event, when in reality it is frequently a prolonged blur. For generations, perhaps centuries, cats may have existed in an intermediate zone neither fully wild nor fully domestic, exploiting people while being exploited in return. The genetic and archaeological signals we see later are the result of many such local experiments accumulating over time. What makes the cat especially unusual is that this half-domestic condition never entirely disappears. Even today, the line between house cat, village cat, farm cat, street cat, and wild living feral cat can be remarkably thin. The domestic cat remains close enough to its ancestry that it can survive outside human homes more successfully than many heavily modified domestic species. That persistence reflects its origins. The first cat of human settlements is not an animal dependent on human provisioning. in the way some later domestic breeds and livestock become. It is an opportunist attaching itself to a new prey-rich world. There is another subtle layer to this story. Agriculture does not only create food for rodents and hunting grounds for cats, it creates a denser emotional world between humans and animals. Settled life changes how people observe non-human creatures. In a mobile hunting camp, an animal may be encountered intensely but briefly. In a village, the same kinds of animals recur day after day, season after season, generation after generation. Familiarity accumulates. Patterns are noticed. Individual creatures become recognizable. It becomes possible, slowly, for a useful wild presence to turn into something more personal. A child sees the same cat return at dusk. A household recognizes the mother with torn ear or striped flank. A village comes to know which corners belong to which hunter. The animal remains itself, but it begins to acquire social presence. This does not mean affection arrives immediately or everywhere. The evidence for early emotional attachment is difficult to measure, and it would be a mistake to project modern pet culture backward too easily. Still, the burial at Cyprus hints at something beyond simple utility. Intentional burial implies recognition, perhaps ritual, perhaps companionship, perhaps status. We do not know. But we do know that once humans begin carrying cats with them, feeding them selectively, tolerating their breeding near homes, and perhaps marking them as belonging to a household or settlement, the relationship has crossed an important threshold. From there, the cat's path broadens, farming spreads, villages link into networks, goods move, rodents follow grain, and cats follow rodents. Human settlement becomes the great engine of feline expansion, not everywhere at once, and not in a straight line, but steadily enough that a once strictly wild hunter begins taking up residence in one of the most successful niches on Earth, the edge of human storage, human warmth, and human waste. The old skills remain untouched. The soft feet, the waiting patience, the territorial caution, the predator's exactness, all of it transfers almost perfectly into this new setting. So the first real alliance between cat and human is born not from domination, but from architecture and appetite. Build a village, and the mice arrive. Store grain, and the mice multiply. Allow a wild cat to hunt among them, and a new relationship begins. No oath binds it. No harness defines it. No fence contains it. The cat enters human history as it enters almost everything else by noticing where the balance of risk and reward has shifted, and stepping forward just far enough to profit from the change. In that narrow distance between fear and advantage, one of the oldest and strangest partnerships in history begins to take form. If the first villages give cats a reason to come closer, Egypt gives them something far stranger. It gives them permanence in the human imagination. Long before the domestic cat becomes a modern companion, long before it settles into parlours, barns, alleys, and internet mythology. It passes through a civilization that looks at the animal and sees more than usefulness. In Egypt, the cat still hunts mice in granaries and birds in marshes. It still moves with the old stealth inherited from wild ancestors. But here that stealth begins to gather symbolism. The patient eyes, the controlled violence, the mysterious independence, the way the animal seems both intimate and unreachable. All of this suits a civilization unusually alert to the sacred meanings hidden inside ordinary life. The Nile world does not invent the cat, and it may not even be the earliest place where people live closely beside it, but it is the place that raises the cat from tolerated hunter to cultural force. The setting matters as much as the animal. Ancient Egypt is a civilization built on rhythm, repetition, and narrow margins. The Nile floods, retreats, and leaves behind fertility in a surrounding world that is otherwise severe. Agriculture depends on cycles that must be watched and managed carefully. Grain is wealth, food, taxation, stability, and survival. Store it badly, and rodents flourish. Let snakes multiply, and danger enters homes and fields. In such a landscape, a small predator that kills the right creatures with precision becomes valuable for obvious reasons. Yet Egypt is not content with obvious reasons. It is a civilization that habitually layers the practical and the sacred together. Objects, animals, and places can hold everyday function and symbolic significance at the same time. The cat fits that mental world with unusual ease. At first, the evidence suggests continuity with the earlier village relationship. Cats in Egypt are useful. They protect food stores. They control vermin. They may help around marshlands and settlements where human life creates dense ecological opportunities. There is no reason to assume that every Egyptian cat is immediately pampered or holy. That would flatten a very long and varied history into a single image. Early representations of felines in Egypt include not only animals that resemble domestic cats, but also larger wild cats and other feline forms that carry distinct meanings. The evidence remains incomplete in places, and scholars still debate the pace at which the smaller domestic cat becomes fully prominent in Egyptian domestic and religious life. What survives in the record suggests a gradual deepening rather than a sudden transformation. Part of the power of cats in Egypt lies in the broader Egyptian fascination with animals as expressions of divine qualities. Egyptian religion does not treat animals simply as symbols in the modern abstract sense. Divine powers can be manifested through animal forms, hybrid forms, specific sacred individuals, or clusters of qualities associated with particular creatures. A falcon can evoke kingship and sky power. A jackal can stand close to death and necropolis space. A crocodile can embody danger, sovereignty, and the river's force. In this landscape of sacred zoology, the cat arrives carrying a very specific combination of attributes: fertility and household life on one side, danger and defensive violence on the other. It is soft, maternal, domestic, and beautiful. It is also armed, alert, and lethally exact. This duality becomes especially visible in the figure of Bastet. The history of Bastet is itself complex. In earlier periods, she is often associated with leonine imagery and a fiercer protective force. Over time, especially by the late 2nd millennium BCE and afterward, her image becomes increasingly associated with the domestic cat. This shift matters because it helps bridge the distance between wild feline power and household feline intimacy. Bastet is not merely a goddess with a cat head in decorative art. She embodies a set of linked ideas: protection of home, fertility, motherhood, sensuality, music, celebration, and warding off harm. That combination is revealing. The cat in Egypt does not become sacred because people forget that it kills. It becomes sacred partly because of how cleanly it combines nurture and threat. One of the striking things about Egyptian visual culture is how naturally cats begin to appear within scenes of domestic order. They sit beneath chairs. They accompany hunting scenes in the marshes. They occupy the edges of family life while remaining vividly themselves. The famous tomb paintings in which cats appear among reeds or under elegant furniture do not present them as alien beings intruding into human space. They suggest familiarity, presence, an accepted place in the household world of elite representation. This does not prove every Egyptian family kept a cat in the modern pet sense, and it certainly does not mean cats lived equally well in every stratum of society. But it does show that the animal had become recognizable enough and valued enough to take on a visible role in how Egyptians imagined daily life. Marsh hunting scenes are especially telling. In such images, cats sometimes appear helping to flush or seize birds during fowling expeditions. The details are debated. Some scholars see these depictions as evidence of trained or semi-trained participation. Others are more cautious, noting that artistic convention, symbolism, and idealized household imagery complicate any straightforward reading. No single explanation fully accounts for every image. Still, the repeated association of cats with these scenes suggests that Egyptians regarded them as more than accidental background creatures. They were participants in the managed ecology of elite life, joining humans in spaces where water, vegetation, birds, and abundance came together. Then there is the darker and more spectacular evidence: mummification. Few details in the history of cats are as famous, or as often misunderstood, as the enormous number of cat mummies associated especially with later Egyptian religious practices. To modern eyes, the practice can seem either sentimental or grotesque depending on how it is described. In reality, it belongs to a religious system in which animals could serve as votive offerings, sacred representatives, or cultic intermediaries. Vast numbers of cats were bred, sacrificed, and mummified, especially in the late period and later under foreign dynasties and Roman rule. This does not necessarily mean every one of these animals was a beloved household companion mourned individually. Many were part of organized temple economies. Their existence reveals reverence, yes, but also industry, ritual demand, and institutional scale. That distinction matters because Egypt's elevation of cats is not purely affectionate. It is social, economic, symbolic, and political as well. Sacred animal cults generate labor, trade, pilgrimage, and wealth. Temples connected to Bastet and other sacred centers become sites where the cat acquires both religious prestige and material significance. The city of Bubastis, closely associated with Bastet, becomes one of the major centers of feline worship. Ancient writers later describe festivals there as exuberant and crowded, though their accounts must be read critically. Even allowing for exaggeration, it is clear that the cult of Bastet plays an important role in Egyptian religious life. The cat is now embedded not only in houses, but in processions, offerings, and sacred geography. At the same time, practical concerns remain close to the surface. Egyptian homes and storehouses still need protection. Cobras and other snakes remain real dangers. Granaries remain vulnerable to infestation. It is precisely this continuity between sacred meaning and ordinary usefulness that gives the cat its unusual strength in Egyptian culture. The animal is not revered despite its daily role. Its daily role helps justify and sharpen the reverence. A creature that protects grain, kills venomous threats, reproduces visibly, nurses attentively, and yet remains half wild in temperament is perfectly suited to Egyptian ways of thinking about order and danger. It guards the threshold between safety and disorder. There is also an emotional dimension that should not be dismissed. Evidence from inscriptions, burials, and artistic depictions suggest that at least some cats are individually valued. In some cases they are named. In some cases, they are mourned. Later, classical sources report that the death of a household cat could provoke visible grief, though such accounts come with the usual problems of outsider observation and dramatic retelling. Still, the cumulative weight of the evidence suggests genuine attachment in at least some contexts. Egypt does not simply exploit cats, it lives with them closely enough for affection to become legible. The political significance of cats also grows in legend. One famous story, repeated in various forms, claims that during a Persian campaign the invaders exploited Egyptian reverence for cats by using the animals strategically, knowing Egyptians would hesitate to strike them. The tale is widely circulated, but its historical reliability is uncertain, and scholars treat it with caution. It may preserve some kernel of cultural truth while exaggerating events for dramatic effect. This is a good example of the cat's Egyptian reputation outgrowing what the evidence can securely prove. Even in antiquity, Egypt's association with feline reverence is strong enough to inspire stories that blur history and anecdote. What seems most secure is that Egypt plays a decisive role in publicizing and amplifying the cat's status across the ancient world. By the time later Mediterranean societies encounter Egyptian culture, the link between Egypt and cats is already powerful. Trade, diplomacy, conquest, imitation, and storytelling all help spread this image outward. The cat becomes not just an animal from the household margin, but an Egyptian creature in the cultural imagination elegant, sacred, useful, slightly uncanny. This reputation will matter later as cats move farther through Mediterranean and imperial networks. Yet the Egyptian cat is never entirely dissolved into symbolism. That is part of what makes it so compelling. Even inside temples and tomb paintings, it remains visibly a hunter. The curved body is poised, the ears are alert, the claws, whether hidden or implied, are always there. Egyptian civilization may polish the cat into art and raise it into cult, but it does not erase the old predator beneath the image. Perhaps that is exactly the point. Civilization in the Nile Valley depends on order imposed against flood, drought, pests, disease, and chaos. The cat embodies a miniature version of that victory. It is elegance holding danger in reserve. It is calm backed by violence. It is domestic life armed with teeth. So by the time the cat leaves the Egyptian world in wider numbers, whether through trade, gift exchange, shipboard movement, or slower diffusion through interconnected societies, it carries more than its own body. It carries prestige. It carries sacred residue. It carries the memory of being seen not merely as useful but as worthy of reverence. No other early civilization wraps the cat in quite the same aura. Egypt does not invent the partnership between human and cat, but it transforms its meaning. In the long history of cats, this is the first great ascent, the moment when a silent village hunter steps into the full light of civilization and finds that people, looking closely, decide it belongs not only in the granary or the courtyard, but in the realm of the eternal. What Egypt does with cats is not simple worship, and not simple affection either. It does something more revealing. It takes an animal already useful in the management of daily life and places it at the intersection of household intimacy, religious symbolism, and the Egyptian obsession with continuity beyond death. The result is a role far richer than the modern shorthand of sacred cat suggests. In Egyptian society, the cat moves through rooms, courtyards, storehouses, shrines, workshops, marshes, and tombs. It is a living hunter, a domestic presence, a sacred emblem, a votive object, and at times a creature bound into systems of breeding, sacrifice, and pilgrimage. The same civilization that admires the cat's grace also turns that grace into ritual economy. The same household that values protection may also value symbolism. This layered place in Egyptian life helps explain why the cat's image survives so strongly. but it also means the history must be separated carefully from later fantasy. The household role comes first because it remains the foundation beneath everything else. In a river civilization built on grain and storage, pest control is never a trivial matter. The cat's ability to patrol domestic spaces, guard food reserves from rodents, and kill snakes or other dangerous small animals gives it a practical importance that is easy to understand and hard to replace. Yet usefulness alone rarely guarantees cultural elevation. Many useful animals remain anonymous. The cat becomes something else because its practical role enters spaces of close human visibility. Unlike an ox in the field or a donkey on the road, the cat shares interiors. It sits near sleeping places, near children, near food preparation, near furniture, near the subtle routines that make up household life. It becomes familiar at close range, and familiarity changes significance. Egyptian images repeatedly place cats in these intimate spaces. In tomb scenes, they appear beneath chairs, beside women, near family settings, or in hunting scenes where elite order is being displayed. These images are not photographs, and they cannot be read naively as straightforward records of ordinary daily life. Egyptian art is formal, selective, and symbolic. Still, the consistency matters. Cats are not shown as strange intruders. They are woven into a recognizable domestic world. Their presence helps signal refinement, stability, and managed abundance. A household with cats is one in which granaries are protected, marshes are productive, and the dangerous edge between civilization and disorder is being held at bay. This household presence overlaps powerfully with motherhood and fertility. Female cats, with their frequent litters and intense maternal care, are especially resonant in a society attentive to reproduction, continuity, and the protection of vulnerable life. Kittens gather naturally around a nursing mother in a way that would have been visually and emotionally obvious to anyone living near them. That image likely helps deepen the association between cats and maternal protection, an association later reinforced in the cult and imagery of Bastet. But the cat's maternal side is only half the story. The same mother that nurses, cleans, and guards her young can also become startlingly violent in defense. Egyptians do not need to invent this duality. They observe it directly. The cat becomes a living model of tenderness with claws, fecundity with force. That combination helps explain why the boundary between domestic life and sacred meaning becomes so porous around cats. Bastet, especially in her later cat-associated forms, embodies joy, fertility, music, dance, and home, but also protective aggression against threatening forces. The cat offers a natural visual shorthand for this. It is beautiful without being harmless, soft without being weak. The household does not become sacred by escaping danger. It becomes sacred by surviving it. The cat belongs in that logic. When Egyptian religion draws divine force close to home, the cat becomes one of its most fitting vessels. At the same time, Egyptian religious life never reduces animals to metaphor alone. Sacred animals can be manifestations, companions, offerings, or living participants in cult practice. This is where later misunderstanding often begins. Modern accounts sometimes imagine that all cats in Egypt were universally pampered, untouchable, and adored in essentially the same way. The evidence does not support such a simple picture. Some cats were clearly valued household animals. Some were linked to temples. Some were bred in large numbers for ritual purposes. Some likely lived ordinary working lives around homes, granaries, workshops, and ports with little ceremony attached to them at all. Egyptian attitudes toward cats are deep, but they are not uniform. The most dramatic evidence for ritual importance comes from cat mummification. Large cat cemeteries and temple deposits reveal that cats could be mummified in enormous numbers, particularly in later periods. Some of these mummies represent beloved animals buried with care. Others are almost certainly votive offerings purchased by worshippers and dedicated in sacred contexts. In many cases, temple institutions appear to have raised cats specifically to meet ritual demand. Modern investigations of mummies, including imaging studies, have shown that not all were treated equally, and not all even contained whole animals. Some held partial remains or symbolic bundles, suggesting a ritual economy more complex and more industrial than older romantic descriptions implied. This does not make the practice insincere. It makes it socially organized. That organization tells us something important about the place of cats in Egyptian religion. Reverence and commodification can coexist. A society may genuinely consider an animal sacred while also breeding, sacrificing, and selling it within temple systems. To modern moral instincts, that can feel contradictory. In ancient Egypt, it is better understood as part of how sacred practice operates materially. Temples require offerings. Pilgrims seek contact with divine power. Animal cults provide a bridge between human need and sacred presence. The cat becomes part of that machinery not because it has ceased to matter, but because it matters so much. The afterlife dimension intensifies this complexity. Egypt is a civilization unusually concerned with preserving order against decay and securing continuity beyond death. To place an animal within funerary space is never a casual gesture. When cats appear in burials, amulets, or temple offerings, they participate in a world where preservation itself has religious meaning. Their image may protect, invoke, or accompany. Their actual bodies, when mummified, may stand as offerings, representatives, or sacred remains. The exact interpretation varies by context, and scholars still debate many cases, but what survives in the record suggests that cats inhabit both the lived house and the imagined eternal house. They cross from daily utility into metaphysical company. This is where myth begins to accumulate around the evidence. Ancient and later writers tell stories of cats being so revered that harming one could bring deadly punishment, or of entire households entering grief rituals at a cat's death. Some of these stories may contain truth in exaggerated form. Others likely reflect the fascinated gaze of outsiders who saw Egyptian animal reverence as both impressive and strange. It would be unwise to dismiss all such reports, but it is equally unwise to repeat them uncritically. The evidence remains uneven. Legal treatment may have varied by period and context. Household grief surely existed in some cases, but the record does not allow us to turn every anecdote into universal law. Egypt's love of the cat was real. The later image of absolute feline sanctity, applied in the broadest possible sense, is much less secure. There is also the question of whether Egyptian cats were fundamentally pets in the modern emotional sense. Here again the answer is both yes and no, depending on what is meant. Some certainly were companions. The intimacy of artistic representation, the care in some burials, and the long household presence all point in that direction. But the modern category of pet brings assumptions shaped by very different economic and emotional worlds. Egyptian cats are not mostly ornamental dependents. They are functional household members whose practical value and symbolic charge reinforce one another. Affection grows in that space, but it does not erase utility. An especially revealing detail is how often the cat remains associated with thresholds. It lives between house and outside, between grain store and wild scavenger, between protective domesticity and barely veiled predation, between living body and sacred image. Even when idealized, it keeps one foot in another realm. This may be part of why Egyptians find it so potent. Many sacred things in Egyptian thought stand at a border between order and chaos, flood and drought, life and death, wilderness and cultivated land. The cat belongs naturally to threshold thinking. It enters homes but does not dissolve into them. It accepts intimacy but preserves alertness. It is near enough to touch and strange enough to revere. No single explanation fully accounts for Egypt's fascination with cats, because that fascination operates on several levels at once. Ecology explains part of it, religion explains part of it, aesthetic preference explains part of it, emotional attachment explains part of it, institutional temple practice explains part of it. Remove any one of these and the picture becomes too thin. Taken together, they show how a small predator can become culturally immense. The cat is not simply lucky in Egypt. It is uniquely well matched to the needs, values, and visual imagination of the civilization. By now the cat is no longer just a village opportunist lingering at the edge of human life. In Egypt it is integrated, represented, ritualized, and exported in image long before it is exported in great numbers as a globally familiar domestic animal. It appears in amulets small enough to carry, in bronzes cast for devotion, in tomb painting, in temple economy, in family space, in funerary landscape. Few animals achieve this kind of range without being transformed beyond recognition. The cat does so while remaining recognizably itself. That is one of the strangest features of its history. People place layer after layer of meaning onto it, yet the animal beneath those meanings remains stubbornly feline watchful, exact, self-possessed. And that stubbornness may be the final reason Egypt never fully consumes the cat in symbolism. It cannot. A cat in a temple image is still an animal that hunts lizards behind walls. A cat buried with reverence is still descended from solitary hunters of scrub and marsh. A cat linked to motherhood and music is still a creature that can strike with shocking speed. The sacred aura gathers around a reality that does not disappear. In that sense, Egyptian civilization does not merely worship the cat. It recognizes something in it that civilization itself admires: poise maintained under threat, beauty sharpened by danger, and order defended by quiet violence. The household cat in Egypt is never only a pet, and never only a god's emblem. It is a living threshold between the ordinary and the eternal. Once cats become established in Egypt's domestic and sacred life, they do not remain there. Animals rarely respect the neat cultural boundaries historians later draw on maps, and cats are especially good at crossing worlds without seeming to do very much at all. They do not march in armies or travel in ceremonial caravans under their own banners. They slip aboard ships, they follow grain, they inhabit ports before anyone thinks to record their movement. They pass from household to warehouse, from warehouse to dock, from dock to vessel, and from vessel to another shore where rodents are already waiting. The spread of cats across the ancient Mediterranean is not one dramatic migration, but a long, irregular seep through trade, empire, and habit. In that slow movement, the cat becomes something larger than an Egyptian animal. It becomes a traveller of human networks. The Mediterranean is almost purpose-built for this transformation. It is not a single world, but a crowded contact zone of islands, coasts, deltas, river mouths, market towns, and imperial ambitions, grain, wine, oil, timber, textiles, metals, pottery, incense, animals, and people move across it continually. Every ship carrying foodstuffs or stored goods creates an invitation to mice and rats. Every port creates a habitat dense with refuse, warehouses, stacked cargo, and hidden corners. For a small predator already adapted to human settlement, the maritime world offers a remarkable opportunity. A cat can be useful on land, but at sea it becomes indispensable. A vessel with rodents is a vessel with gnawed ropes, contaminated stores, and threatened survival. The logic is obvious even if the records are thin. Where goods go, vermin follow. Where vermin follow, cats earn passage. This probably happens in stages. At first, cats may move unintentionally, or semi-intentionally, among neighbouring zones linked by commerce. A cat that frequents docks or storage areas could easily end up aboard a boat. Once its value becomes apparent during the voyage, tolerance becomes encouragement. Before long, there is little reason not to bring such animals deliberately. The evidence remains incomplete because ancient people rarely paused to document the humble logistics of pest control in detail. But archaeological finds, artistic depictions, and later historical patterns strongly suggest that seafaring plays a major role in feline expansion. Ships need cats, even if no formal policy says so. That practical truth may have spread the species farther and faster than any ceremonial exchange. Phoenician traders are often associated with the westward spread of cats through Mediterranean networks, and this may hold some truth, though the exact mechanisms remain debated. The Phoenicians link coasts from the Levant to North Africa, Iberia, and beyond. They establish colonies, exchange goods, and intensify maritime connectivity on a large scale. In such systems, a useful shipboard hunter would travel well, yet it would be too simple to assign the cat spread to a single people. Egypt, Levantine societies, later Greek and Roman networks, and countless smaller local exchanges all contribute. No single explanation fully accounts for every route or timing. What survives in the record suggests a braided process in which multiple maritime cultures help move cats outward from their core zones. This outward spread does something subtle to the cat's identity. In Egypt, the animal carries a strong sacred and symbolic association. Outside Egypt, that aura does not vanish, but it changes. As cats enter new societies, they are interpreted through local needs and beliefs. Some places receive them first as practical hunters, others absorb them through trade prestige, imitation, or curiosity. In one port, a cat may be prized because it protects grain. In another, it may be exotic, associated with foreign lands and habits. In another, it may simply become part of dockside reality so gradually that no one remembers when it first arrived. The cat is good at this kind of cultural adaptation because its value is obvious even when its symbolism is not. The animal also adapts well to fragmented geographies. Islands, especially, play a revealing role in the history of cats. Human beings carry them across water because islands with stored food and limited predator communities are ideal places for rodents to thrive. Yet islands are also ecologically vulnerable. A cat introduced for practical reasons can become a new force in the local environment, preying not only on pests but on birds, reptiles, and small mammals with little evolutionary preparation for such hunters. This tension appears again and again across feline history. The same qualities that make cats useful to humans make them dangerous to isolated ecosystems. In the ancient Mediterranean, this may not always have been recognized clearly, but the ecological consequences begin early. Trade routes do not move only animals, they move stories and habits. Once cats begin appearing regularly in ports and homes beyond their earlier centres, people start learning how to live with them. Kittens may be exchanged as gifts. Households may begin preserving lines of especially tolerant or effective mouses without anything like formal breeding. Children grow up with animals their grandparents perhaps never saw. familiarity changes language, custom, and representation. A creature that was once foreign becomes ordinary, then intimate. This process is easy to underestimate because it leaves uneven traces, but it may be one of the most consequential changes in the whole history of cats. The animal stops being tied to one civilization's sacred imagination and starts becoming a portable element of urban and domestic life across many civilizations. The Greeks provide an interesting example of cultural negotiation in this process. Early on, cats do not necessarily hold the same central place in Greek life that they later hold in broader Mediterranean worlds. Other animals, including weasels and ferrets or ferret-like pest controllers in some contexts, may remain important. The evidence suggests a mixed picture rather than instant feline dominance. Scholars still debate how widespread domestic cats are in different Greek periods and regions, and there is reason to be cautious about assuming uniform adoption. Yet over time, cats do become more familiar in Hellenistic and interconnected Mediterranean settings, particularly as trade intensifies and Egyptian influence expands. The old Egyptian prestige may have helped, but the practical advantage of the animal matters just as much. In the wider Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, imperial connections accelerate the process. Conquest does not move only armies and taxes, it rearranges infrastructures. Administrative centers grow, warehouses expand, roads and harbors intensify. Food moves farther in larger quantities. Such systems create ideal conditions for rodents, and therefore sustain demand for predators that can travel with commerce. In this sense, cats are beneficiaries of early globalization. Wherever states and merchants thicken the movement of grain and goods, they also create a niche for an animal that can protect those goods at relatively low cost. There is something almost paradoxical in how cats spread through empire. Unlike the horse, they are not emblems of conquest. Unlike cattle, they do not visibly transform landscapes through grazing. Unlike camels, they do not symbolize long-distance trade in grand, obvious ways. Their contribution is quiet, infrastructural, nearly invisible. They defend the hidden economies beneath the visible ones. A granary with fewer mice means more stable taxation. A ship with protected provisions means safer voyages. A port warehouse with fewer infestations means less waste. The cat serves empire not through spectacle, but through maintenance. It is one of history's great backstage animals. At the same time, the cat does not become merely a machine for pest control. As it enters new households, it continues generating emotional and symbolic responses. A sleeping cat in a foreign merchant's house is still beautiful. A mother cat with kittens still attracts attention. A shipboard cat that survives storms alongside sailors may become more than useful. The evidence for individual affection is scattered, but it would be strange if such bonds did not multiply as cats spread. Human beings are susceptible to animals that combine utility with charisma, and few creatures do that as effectively as cats. They arrive because they kill mice. They stay because they also become part of the texture of ordinary life. This is the period when the cat's reputation begins widening in ways that later centuries will inherit. It is no longer just a local hunter or a sacred Egyptian being. It is a recognizable domestic presence moving through markets, temples, farms, docks, and townhouses from one coast to another. Its image travels too. Artistic motifs, stories, and imported objects help reinforce familiarity. The exact symbolic role changes, but the aura of elegance and alertness remains. So does the old ambiguity. A cat can live beside humans without fully belonging to them. That ambiguity may even increase its appeal. It seems to choose proximity without surrender. In a world of masters and subjects, it offers a different model of coexistence. As cats move farther west and north, climate and environment begin shaping them in small but significant ways. Not all regions resemble the Nile or Levant. Colder winters, denser woodlands, rougher coastlines, and different prey communities create new pressures. What survives in the record suggests that cats remain adaptable at this modest scale. They do not transform instantly into regional breeds in the later formal sense, but populations may begin diverging slightly in appearance and behaviour depending on isolation, interbreeding, and local conditions. This is a slow process, and much remains uncertain. But it reminds us that the spread of cats is not purely a cultural story. It is also biological drift through a widening human-made world. There are likely setbacks too. Cats do not spread evenly or uncontested. Some communities may see little use for them at first. Others may prefer existing pest control animals. In some places their numbers may remain low for long periods. The archaeological record can make expansion look smoother than it was because survival of evidence is uneven. But over centuries, the broader pattern is unmistakable. Once embedded in trade and maritime life, the cat becomes extremely difficult to confine to one region. It moves with the grain routes, with household habits, with colonial settlement, and with the slow practical wisdom of people who realize that a small hunter on a ship or in a storeroom is worth keeping. What matters most in this stage is that the cat becomes legible across cultural borders. A merchant from one shore may not share the gods, language, or laws of another, but he understands a granary under threat. He understands spoiled stores, gnawed baskets, frightened crew, and the sudden usefulness of a watchful animal slipping through cargo in low light. This practical comprehension gives the cat a passport broader than religion or ethnicity. It is one of the rare animals whose route to global importance begins not with domination but with compatibility. It fits the systems people build almost too well. By the end of this phase, the cat has crossed a threshold as important as any temple cult or burial. It has become mobile with civilization itself, not yet universal, not yet fully settled in every corner, but unmistakably on the move. Empires rise and fall, ports change hands, languages shift around harbour walls. Through all this, the cat keeps travelling. It crouches in the dark hold. It steps lightly through grain dust. It emerges on a new shore already suited to the world waiting there. What began as a wary hunter at the margins of the first farms is becoming something larger, a companion of exchange, an invisible passenger of empire, and one of the most successful fellow travellers human civilization will ever carry with it. By the time Rome begins stitching the Mediterranean and much of Europe into a single imperial system, the cat is already travelling through older networks of trade and household life. Rome does not invent the spread of cats any more than it invents roads, grain, or cities. What it does is enlarge everything. It scales movement up. It links provinces more tightly. It builds and maintains infrastructures through which food, soldiers, tax revenues, merchants, household goods, and unwanted animals all move with greater regularity. In such a world, the cat finds ideal conditions to become less exotic and more ordinary. That ordinariness matters. A creature becomes historically powerful not only when it is revered, but when it becomes expected. The Roman Empire depends on transport and storage at a scale earlier societies rarely match. Grain from Egypt and North Africa feeds cities far from the fields that produce it. Military supplies move along roads and rivers to frontier zones. Warehouses and ports operate as the hidden organs of imperial life. Every system of concentrated storage creates opportunities for infestation. Mice and rats are among the great uninvited beneficiaries of empire, thriving wherever human beings gather goods in quantity. The Roman answer is not only architectural and administrative, it is biological as well. The small hunter that has already learned to profit from granaries, ships, and domestic interiors now moves more deeply into the built world of Rome. There is a temptation to imagine that cats sweep across Roman territory in a single obvious wave, neatly replacing older pest control animals. The real picture is probably much messier. Scholars still debate how widespread domestic cats are in different parts of the Roman world at different times, and the evidence remains incomplete. In some areas, cats appear relatively late or remain less visible in the surviving record than modern assumptions might suggest. Other animals, including weasels and perhaps other small predators, continue to serve practical roles. No single explanation fully accounts for the varying pace of feline adoption across such a vast and diverse empire. Yet the broader trend is clear enough. Roman connectivity helps normalize the cat. Normalization works through repetition more than spectacle. In a port city, a cat in a warehouse stops being unusual. In a military outpost, a cat around stored grain becomes simply useful. In a townhouse, courtyard, workshop, or farmstead, the animal enters daily life without needing ritual elevation. Rome is not Egypt. It does not wrap the cat in the same sacred density. Roman religion contains many animal associations and absorbs gods and customs from across conquered territories. But the domestic cat in Roman life is more often practical, decorative, or companionable than overtly divine. That shift is important. It frees the cat, in a sense, from depending on a specific sacred framework. It can now spread as habit. Roman towns and villas create especially favourable environments. Human settlement under Roman rule is not identical from Britain to Syria, of course, but many settlements share structural features that matter to cats' grain storage. Kitchens, refuse zones, enclosed spaces, walls, roofing, human density, and regular food movement. A cat can work these environments with minimal training. It needs no elaborate integration. It needs tolerance, prey, and enough safety to breed. This is one reason cats fit Roman life so well. An empire that values order and efficiency often benefits from animals that require little management once established. The military frontier deserves attention too. Rome's edges are full of movement, uncertainty, and stored provisions. Forts, camps, depots, and marching columns create recurring ecological niches for rodents. A cat in such places may be as useful as one in a merchant port. Yet the frontier also highlights a broader truth about feline expansion. Animals often move with empires not because states plan their distribution in a centralized way, but because countless local actors keep finding them useful. A quartermaster, a cook, a sailor, a farmer, a merchant household, a dock worker. Any of them may tolerate or encourage cats for practical reasons. Empire provides the roads. Ordinary people do the rest. Archaeological evidence from Roman sites helps sketch this picture, though not always cleanly. Cat bones appear at settlements in different parts of the empire, sometimes in context suggesting domestic life, sometimes in less interpretable deposits. Artistic depictions and written references exist, but not with the overwhelming frequency later cat-loving cultures might lead one to expect. This unevenness matters. It reminds us not to project backward a fully modern familiarity. Cats are spreading, but their place is still developing. In some provinces they may be well established. In others they may remain uncommon or overshadowed by other practical animals. The Roman world is not one household but many. Still, the symbolic atmosphere around cats begins to broaden in interesting ways. Roman society, especially at elite levels, absorbs luxury goods, religious ideas, and aesthetic influences from Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. The cat may retain some trace of exotic prestige in certain contexts, particularly where Egyptian styles or cults are fashionable. Yet the deeper transformation lies elsewhere. The cat becomes legible not only as an imported curiosity, but as part of ordinary civilized life. This matters for Europe above all. Once cats become familiar inside Romanized settlements, roads, and estates, they gain footholds far beyond the Mediterranean cores where earlier domestic forms are strongest. That foothold is especially significant in places where winters are colder and ecological conditions differ from those of the Nile or Levant. The cat does not cease to be the same animal, but its daily life changes. It shelters more closely with human structures. It navigates barns, granaries, kitchens, stable yards, and rougher provincial settlements. What survives in the record suggests that cats remain adaptable within these limits. They can survive harsher weather if human settlement provides warmth and prey. That relationship further deepens the bond between cat and built environment. The species is becoming not merely adjacent to civilization, but dependent on certain types of civilized density for its broad success. The Roman household also offers another path for feline integration companionship. It would be too strong to claim that Roman culture, in general, treats cats as beloved companion animals in the later sense that some modern societies do. Dogs are often more visible in Roman literary and artistic representations of household affection, loyalty, and status. Yet there is little reason to think cats never inspire personal attachment. A useful animal that shares interior space, handles vermin, raises visible litters, and occupies domestic rhythms will inevitably become familiar to children and adults alike. The evidence may be quieter than in later eras, but affection likely travels beside utility here as elsewhere. At the same time, Roman expansion creates the conditions for more than household familiarity. It creates ecological entrenchment. Once cats reach new regions with sustained urban and agricultural networks, they no longer need continuous reintroduction. They can breed locally, establish semi-independent populations, and move between domestic, farm, and feral life with the fluidity that still characterizes them. This is one of the great strengths of the cat's historical position. Unlike livestock tightly controlled by owners, cats can occupy a blurred zone between belonging and free-living existence. That blurred zone may frustrate human attempts at complete control, but it greatly aids expansion. This period may also mark an important shift in European perception. Before and during early Roman contact, some regions of Europe may have little familiarity with the domestic cat, or may know it only dimly. As Roman influence brings new goods, practices, and settlement patterns, the animal becomes one more element in the spread of Mediterranean domestic life. Not always glamorous, not always remarked upon, but present. In this sense, the cat participates in Romanization, though in a modest and practical register. It is not a monument, not a law code, not an aqueduct. It is the quiet life inside the storeroom and by the hearth. Then comes the instability. As Roman authority weakens in different regions, urban systems contract unevenly, frontiers shift, and long-distance order becomes less secure. But by then the cat is not easily removed. Once present in farms, villages, ports, and towns, it can survive through disruption so long as human settlement endures in some form. This resilience is important. Empires may have accelerated its spread, but the cat no longer depends on imperial coherence. It has learned the local scales of survival, the farmhouse granary, the monastery store, the market street, the riverside settlement, the fishing village, the reused ruins of older Roman towns. In the wreckage or afterlife of empire, it remains useful. There is a certain irony in this. Rome excels at imposing visible systems, roads surveyed, cities planned, taxes extracted, frontiers defended. The cat serves Rome best in invisible ways. It protects stores before spoilage becomes obvious. It reduces loss before officials calculate it. It works at night, in corners, under floors, inside walls, near sacks and baskets where imperial order is most vulnerable to quiet erosion. In a sense, the cat polices the empire from below. Not the empire of emperors and generals, but the empire of bread, shipment, storage, and continuity. That practical service may have done as much as any cultural prestige to secure its place across Europe. By the end of Rome's great age, the cat is still not everywhere in equal density, and it is not yet surrounded by the full mythology it will later acquire in medieval and early modern imagination. But it has crossed another threshold. It has become familiar across a vast and varied geography. Roads, ports, villas, market towns, army depots, river routes, and household routines have all helped move it outward. The evidence may not let us trace every paw step, but the pattern is there. The cat is no longer simply an animal of the Nile and Near East, nor merely a shipboard mouser haunting Mediterranean harbours. It is becoming a European presence, and like so much that Rome spreads, it outlasts the empire itself, long after official power fragments, long after frontier lines fail and cities shrink. The cat remains in the cracks and continuities of daily life. It slips through post-Roman darkness, carrying old skills into new uncertainties. The roads decay, but grain is still stored. Warehouses collapse, but barns remain. Taxes change hands. Gods change names. Armies come and go. Yet somewhere in the half-light of a storeroom a cat still waits without moving, ears fixed on the faintest rustle. That is how the Roman chapter ends for the cat, not in ceremony, but in persistence, ready to pass from imperial order into the stranger, harsher centuries ahead. When Roman order thins and Europe enters the long, uneven centuries that follow, the cat does not disappear, but it becomes harder to see clearly. The written record narrows. Archaeology becomes more fragmentary. Habits continue without always being described. This is one reason the medieval history of cats is so tangled in legend. The animal remains present in homes, barns, ports, monasteries, and market towns, but its image in later memory grows far larger, darker, and simpler than the evidence safely allows. It is often said that medieval Europe turned viciously against cats, especially black cats, driving them into association with witchcraft and helping unleash plague by reducing their numbers. Parts of that story contain elements of truth, but as a complete explanation it is too neat, too theatrical, and too eager to make history behave like a moral tale. The real medieval cat lives in a more complicated world, one in which usefulness, affection, suspicion, folklore, and fear coexist. The practical role of cats never goes away. Medieval Europe is full of stored grain, kitchens, dairies, barns, monasteries, breweries, fishing towns, merchant warehouses, and castles, all of them vulnerable to rodents. A cat in such places is not a luxury. It is part of the everyday defense of food and property. Manuscripts, account books, legal records, and visual art do not always dwell on these ordinary facts. but enough evidence survives to show that cats remain embedded in domestic and working life. They appear in illuminations, marginal images, household contexts, and documentary traces that suggest familiarity rather than rarity. Monastic sites in particular remind us that places devoted to prayer and scholarship are also places full of stored food, manuscripts vulnerable to gnawing pests, and buildings with many quiet corners. A monastery without cats would be a difficult place to maintain. This alone should make one cautious about the more extreme stories of universal feline persecution. Medieval people do not suddenly forget what cats are good for. They live too close to scarcity for that. In villages and towns across Europe, a competent mouser is a practical asset. Kittens are raised. Farm cats breed. Market cats haunt storage areas. Ship cats continue their old work in ports and on vessels. What changes is not the utility of the animal, but the symbolic atmosphere surrounding it in certain contexts. Christianity reshapes the spiritual landscape of Europe, and with it the meanings attached to animals, magic, sexuality, heresy, and night. In such a world, the cat's old ambiguities can darken. Part of the problem is that cats are unusually difficult to moralize into clear categories. Dogs can be praised for loyalty and obedience, virtues that fit neatly into many human social and religious ideals. Horses can symbolize nobility, war, or prestige. Sheep and cattle are easy to fold into sacrificial or pastoral metaphors. Cats resist this kind of moral domestication. They're useful, but not obedient in the same way. They're intimate, but not eager to please. They move at night. Their eyes glow in low light. They vocalize in unnerving ways during mating or conflict. They vanish and reappear. They seem attached to houses while remaining partly outside them, in a culture attentive to signs, omens, moral symbolism, and spiritual danger. This can make them seem unstable in meaning. Medieval folklore reflects that instability. Cats can appear as household creatures, comic thieves, companions of old women, sly hunters, or uncanny beings linked to the margins of ordinary order. Black cats in particular begin gathering ominous associations in some traditions, though not uniformly and not all at once. Colour symbolism, darkness, night movement, and visual strangeness all contribute. But it would be a mistake to imagine a single medieval European attitude. Regional variation is enormous. A cat might be treated casually in one place, affectionately in another, mockingly in a third, and suspiciously in a fourth. Folklore is not law, and symbolic unease does not always translate into mass action. Still, the relationship between cats and witchcraft accusations becomes increasingly important in later medieval and early modern imagination. This does not mean medieval Europe everywhere sees cats as agents of evil. It means that in some theological and popular frameworks, especially where anxieties about heresy, sorcery, female disorder, and demonic deception intensify, the cat becomes available as an image of troubling companionship. It can be linked to the solitary woman, the healer, the widow, the poor household, the night wanderer. None of these links are inevitable, and many are far clearer in later witch hunt culture than in the earlier Middle Ages. Scholars still debate how early and how widely these associations take hold. The evidence remains incomplete, and later propaganda often colours how earlier material is interpreted. This is where the famous story about cats and the Black Death usually enters. According to a popular modern version, medieval Europeans killed large numbers of cats because they associated them with evil, thereby allowing rat populations to increase and worsening the plague. It is an attractive story because it offers dramatic irony. superstition destroys a useful animal and helps unleash catastrophe. The problem is that history is rarely so tidy. The Black Death in the 14th century is spread primarily by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted in complicated ways involving fleas, rodents, and in some cases human ectoparasites and other pathways scholars continue to study. The role of rats themselves is more complex than older textbook versions once implied, varying by region and outbreak conditions, and there is no clear evidence for a continent-wide extermination of cats immediately before the plague that would support the simplified popular claim. No single explanation fully accounts for the spread of plague, and blaming it on cat persecution alone is not supported by serious scholarship. That does not mean hostility toward cats is invented. There are certainly cases of cruelty, ritualized abuse, mockery, and suspicion. Medieval festivals in some regions involve rough treatment of animals, including cats, as part of wider patterns of symbolic violence that are disturbing to modern readers but not unique to cats. Some clerical or moral texts depict cats negatively, especially in association with lust, treachery, or feminine disorder. Certain heresy accusations include animal imagery meant to evoke inversion and disgust. Yet this darker material exists alongside continued everyday dependence on cats. A society may insult an animal symbolically and still keep it in the barn. It may fear what the creature represents at night and still appreciate what it kills before dawn. Literary and artistic evidence captures this ambiguity well. Cats appear in manuscripts not only as sinister figures, but as playful or ordinary ones. Some illuminations show them stealing food, stalking mice, or simply existing within familiar interiors. Satirical and comic traditions make use of feline behavior because it is recognizable. This suggests close observation, which in turn suggests continued proximity. You do not build good jokes around animals people rarely see. Even when cats are mocked, they are present enough to be understood. In that sense, medieval culture keeps the cat close while refusing to settle on a single meaning for it. The social position of women may also help explain part of the cat's medieval reputation. Cats are small, inexpensive to keep, and compatible with household economies at the margins. They're useful to widows, older women, solitary people, and the urban poor in ways that larger animals are not. In periods when female independence, folk knowledge, or marginal domestic authority come under suspicion, the animals associated with those spaces can absorb some of that suspicion too. This does not create the later witch's cat all at once, but it helps prepare the imaginative ground. The evidence must be handled carefully here, because retrospective stereotypes can easily overwhelm what medieval sources actually say. Still, the association between cats and socially ambiguous domestic life seems to deepen over time. At the same time, there are regions and contexts where cats are simply valued. Barn records, household traces, and common sense all point the same way. You do not preserve grain in a difficult climate, in a world of recurrent crop failure and urban fire, without appreciating whatever keeps vermin down. Cats may not enjoy the uniformly elevated symbolic status they hold in ancient Egypt, but they remain woven into the infrastructure of medieval survival. They are, as ever, backstage animals. Their work is quiet enough that it disappears into routine, until a society later tries to tell stories about what it fears and suddenly notices how strange the animal always looked. Ports and ships remain especially important during this period. Medieval maritime life, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea and Baltic, continues to rely on protecting provisions from rodents. A ship cat is an old solution to a permanent problem. This continuity matters because it prevents the cat from becoming purely local or purely symbolic. Even in harsh centuries of fragmentation, the animal continues moving with trade. Cloth, grain, salt, timber, wine, furs, and fish all cross waters where cats prowl below decks and along the wharves. The medieval world may be politically fractured, but its commercial arteries remain alive enough to keep the cat in circulation. By now, then, the European cat lives in two overlapping realities. In one, it is a plain creature of the house, the quay, the granary, the stable, the monastery, the alley. In the other, it gathers unease night, femininity, secrecy, disobedience, sensuality, bad luck, occult possibility. Most people likely navigate both realities without much difficulty. They may joke about cats, distrust some of their habits, notice their eerie qualities, and still toss them scraps because the grain bins matter more than theology at sunrise. History often works like that. Symbolic tension does not erase practical need. What the medieval centuries do, more than anything, is preserve the cat while changing its tone. The old sacred glow from Egypt is mostly gone in Europe. In its place comes a fluctuating mixture of tolerance and tension. The cat survives because it remains useful, but it also becomes one of the animals onto which a Christianized, anxious, and often morally charged society can project unease. That unease never fully defines the cat, yet it leaves a long shadow. Later centuries will remember the shadow more vividly than the daily familiarity that coexisted with it. So the medieval cat moves through candlelight and grain dust, through church towns and fishing ports, through plague years and ordinary winters, carrying both meanings at once. It is stroked by hands that also cross themselves at strange noises in the dark. It sleeps by the hearth and slips into the yard at night like a creature returning briefly to another order of life. That doubleness may be why it survives so strongly in memory. The dog belongs to the human world openly. The cat belongs to it conditionally. Medieval Europe senses that condition and never quite relaxes around it. Yet when the sack of grain is safe in the morning, the cat remains. If medieval Western Europe often looks at the cat with a mixture of need and unease, the Islamic world preserves a different emotional and cultural climate around the animal. This does not mean every cat is cherished equally from Al-Andalus to Central Asia, nor that all Muslim societies share one uniform attitude across centuries. The Islamic world is too large, too varied, and too historically dynamic for that. But taken broadly, the record suggests a notable pattern. Cats are often treated with unusual familiarity, tolerance, and respect. They move through courtyards, markets, mosques, ports, and homes without attracting the same consistent symbolic suspicion that hardens in parts of Christian Europe. The difference is not absolute, but it is real enough to matter in the long history of the species. In these lands, the cat becomes not only useful, but culturally at ease. Part of this rests on continuity with older Near Eastern and Mediterranean patterns. Long before Islam, cats are already present across Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and connected trade zones. They are familiar in urban life, familiar in storage economies, familiar in domestic spaces. Islam does not introduce the cat into these regions. It inherits a world where the animal is already established. Yet inheritance alone does not explain the tone. Religious tradition, urban density, patterns of charity, and habits of cleanliness all help shape the distinctive place cats come to occupy in many Islamic societies. One of the strongest influences is the broad cultural preference for cleanliness and the practical management of shared space. Cities in the medieval and early modern Islamic world can be large, crowded, and commercially intense, with markets, bakeries, storehouses, homes, fountains, baths, schools, caravanserais, and mosques, all producing food residues and sheltered corners where rodents might thrive. In such environments, a small predator that keeps vermin under control while requiring little direct management is useful in the most obvious sense. Cats fit urban Muslim life as comfortably as they once fit the granaries of the first farmers, but beyond practicality, they also fit the moral aesthetics of many households: tidy, self-grooming, discreet, and well-suited to close domestic proximity. Islamic legal and ethical traditions do not present the cat as ritually filthy in the way dogs are often treated in many juristic discussions. This distinction has enormous consequences, while views on dogs vary by region, school, and function. The cat generally escapes the stronger forms of ritual discomfort attached to canine saliva or proximity in certain legal contexts. That does not mean cats are sacred, and certainly not beyond criticism or annoyance, but does mean they are easier to welcome into homes, shops, and religiously significant spaces without generating the same legal or symbolic tension. The result is cumulative. Over generations, the cat becomes normal, not only in practical, but in moral terms. Stories associated with the Prophet Muhammad and cats contribute further to this atmosphere. Though the historical reliability and status of specific anecdotes vary, some popular tales, especially the famous story of the Prophet cutting part of his garment rather than disturb a sleeping cat, are beloved in later tradition, but not strongly grounded in the most rigorous early sources. Scholars still debate the strength and transmission of various cat-related reports, and it is important not to treat all later devotional storytelling as equally authoritative. Yet even if some anecdotes are weak as strict historical evidence, their popularity reveals something significant. Muslim societies often want the cat close to gentleness, mercy, and everyday piety. That desire itself becomes part of the cultural record. There are stronger and more widely cited traditions as well, including reports concerning the cleanliness of cats and their presence in domestic life. These help support an atmosphere in which cats are treated as acceptable companions in inhabited spaces. Once that baseline is set, many smaller habits reinforce it. A shopkeeper allows a cat to sleep beside stacked goods. A household leaves scraps near a doorway. A mosque courtyard tolerates resident cats. A traveller in a caravanserai notices them moving at dusk between saddlebags, kitchens, and storerooms. None of these acts needs ceremony. Together, they produce one of the great urban cat cultures of history. Cairo is perhaps the most famous example, though by no means the only one. In Egyptian and broader Islamic urban life, cats become so visible that they impress travellers and later writers alike. They gather in markets, near food vendors, around religious complexes, and in residential quarters. Some are cared for by individuals, others live on a looser network of tolerance and casual feeding. The distinction between owned cat and communal cat remains fluid, just as it often does elsewhere in feline history. But the overall effect is striking. The city does not merely permit cats, it seems built to accommodate them. This is especially true where dense human settlement, regular food traces, and social habits of small-scale charity combine to create stable semi-domestic populations. There is also a literary and intellectual dimension. In Adab literature, anecdote collections, zoological writing, and everyday observation, cats often appear as creatures worth noting for their habits, cunning, cleanliness, and charm. They are not always idealized. Writers can describe them as thieves, opportunists, or comically self-interested, which of course they often are. but the tone is usually one of amused familiarity rather than metaphysical distrust. This is an important difference. A cat stealing from a kitchen may be annoying, but it is still part of the social fabric. Humour, after all, often signals intimacy more than rejection. Sufi stories and popular urban traditions sometimes deepen the cat's association with quiet companionship and humble presence. Again, caution is needed because later layers of storytelling can blur exact historical origins. Yet the recurring motif is revealing the cat as a creature of stillness, observation, and proximity to human spiritual life without disrupting it. In courtyards of lodges, at the edges of gatherings, beneath benches or near lamps, the cat becomes one of those minor presences that make inhabited sacred space feel continuous with ordinary life. It neither demands attention nor entirely escapes it. Trade across the Islamic world also helps consolidate feline presence on a vast scale. From the Maghreb, across the Middle East, into Persia, Central Asia, the Indian Ocean, and beyond, commercial networks move goods, grain, textiles, people, and with them the ecological problems that cats solve so well. Ports in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, caravan cities inland, and ship routes stretching toward East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia all provide corridors for feline movement. The Islamic world is one of history's great connective zones, and cats thrive in connective zones. Their spread eastward and southward owes much to these routes, though never to trade alone. Human habits of tolerance and feeding matter just as much as transport. This more favourable cultural climate also shapes memory. Where Western Europe often remembers cats through the lens of witchcraft, darkness, or troubling femininity, many Islamic societies remember them through domestic ease, religious permissibility, and urban familiarity. That does not eliminate cruelty or indifference. Street animals everywhere face hunger, injury, and neglect, nor does it mean all cats are treasured. But it does produce a contrasting legacy, one in which the cat is not fundamentally out of place. It belongs in the lane, the shop, the courtyard, the threshold of the mosque, the warm wall at sunset. The Islamic world's treatment of cats may also preserve something older about the species, something closer to the early commensal bargain that first brought cats near human settlements. The cat is useful, but not enslaved. Welcome, but not fully owned. Familiar, but never entirely absorbed. It lives beside human order while retaining the ability to slip beyond it. This arrangement is especially visible in cities where community-fed cats occupy semi-public life. They are not pets in the modern enclosed sense, nor are they wholly wild. They remain in that ancient in-between category that has served the species so well for millennia. There are lesser-known details here that reveal just how deeply the cat enters urban Muslim life. Historical endowments and charitable provisions in some cities appear to support the feeding of animals, including cats, though the documentation varies by place and period. Later Ottoman and regional traditions especially preserve the idea that feeding cats is a meritorious act. While one must be careful not to project later practices too neatly backward across the entire Islamic world, these examples suggest a long-standing moral comfort with seeing cats as legitimate recipients of everyday compassion. Such habits do more than keep animals alive. They shape the visual and emotional texture of cities. This cultural comfort helps cats flourish across generations. In homes, they remain mouses and companions. In markets, they become unofficial guardians of stored food. In ports, they continue their ancient maritime work. In religious precincts, they become tolerated regulars. In literature, they become familiar characters. In children's lives, they become part of ordinary memory. A civilization does not need to declare an animal sacred in order to give it lasting sanctuary. Sometimes it is enough to make it unsurprising, and that may be the key difference in this chapter of the cat's history. The Islamic world does not raise the cat into divine symbolism as ancient Egypt once did, nor does it burden it quite so heavily with occult suspicion as parts of Christian Europe later will. Instead, it lets the cat settle into a durable middle ground of esteem, usefulness, and affection. This turns out to be one of the safest cultural positions an animal can occupy. To be sacred can be dangerous. To be feared can be dangerous. To be quietly welcomed, generation after generation, is often better. So while Europe tells darker stories in candlelit winters, cats in many Muslim cities move through a different atmosphere. They nap under market stalls in afternoon heat. They drink from fountains. They patrol date stores, grain sacks, and kitchens. They weave between worshippers' feet in courtyards open to the sky. They are fed, scolded, laughed at, admired, and largely allowed to remain themselves. In this long chapter, the cat does something it has always done best. It enters human society deeply without surrendering its old autonomy. And for once, much of the surrounding culture seems to find that not unsettling, but perfectly natural. As cats move farther east, their history becomes more diffuse, more varied, and in some ways more difficult to pin down with certainty. The great westward arc through Egypt, the Mediterranean, and Europe can be followed through familiar empires and abundant later memory. The eastward story stretches across different climates, older local animal traditions, maritime corridors, caravan routes, and cultural worlds that do not all describe cats in the same way or preserve the same kinds of evidence. Yet the broader pattern is unmistakable. Once cats become reliable companions of trade, storage, and settled life, they do not stop at the Levant or the Persian plateau. They travel with merchants, pilgrims, sailors, imperial households, monks, port communities, and ordinary families into South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, where they encounter societies ready to reinterpret them in distinct and lasting ways. In some regions, this movement may be earlier than the surviving evidence clearly shows. In others, it is tied more visibly to expanding commercial networks. Scholars still debate parts of the timeline, and the archaeological record remains incomplete, especially where preservation is uneven or earlier finds are difficult to distinguish from local wildcat populations and later domestic forms. No single explanation fully accounts for the spread of cats across Asia. Some routes are maritime, especially through the Indian Ocean and South China Sea worlds. Others are overland, moving through Persian, Central Asian, and Chinese connections that carry luxury goods, grain, textiles, manuscripts, and the lesser recorded practical animals that help protect such cargo. The cat, as ever, travels in the shadow of what people value enough to store. South Asia offers one of the first major expansions of this Eastern story. Here, cats arrive in landscapes already crowded with symbolic animals, dense agricultural systems, and long traditions of village and urban life. They're hardly entering an empty, imaginative field. Indian societies have their own ancient associations with tigers, lions, monkeys, snakes, elephants, cows, and a wide range of animals woven into religion, folklore, and everyday survival. A small domestic cat does not automatically command the same cultural attention, yet practical need gives it a foothold. Grain stores, merchant compounds, temple kitchens, houses, and ports all create the same rodent-rich environments that have favoured cats elsewhere. What changes is the symbolic layering. South Asian traditions preserve a mixed and sometimes intriguing relationship with cats. In some stories and folk tales, the cat appears as a sly, opportunistic, even hypocritical creature, capable of comic deception and self-interest. That is hardly unique to India, but it does show how quickly feline behaviour lends itself to moral storytelling. At the same time, cats are plainly present in domestic life. They are familiar enough to be used in proverb, joke, and cautionary tale. In some local traditions, the animal's reproductive habits, stealth, or appetite become symbolic material. In others, it remains simply a useful household hunter. The evidence suggests no single civilizational attitude, but rather a patchwork of practical familiarity and shifting local interpretation. Trade matters especially here because South Asia is one of history's great junctions between inland and maritime worlds. Ports along the western and eastern coasts connect the Islamic world, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Inland routes connect courts, temple towns, and agrarian regions. Cats fit naturally into these systems. They belong on ships. They belong in warehouses. They belong in kitchens and storerooms. Whether prized, tolerated, or barely remarked upon, they move through the infrastructure of exchange with the same quiet competence they have shown for millennia. From there, the story grows even more distinctive in East Asia. China, above all, develops a long and rich relationship with cats, though the exact origins and early stages remain subjects of active scholarly discussion. One especially interesting complication is that China appears to have had an earlier relationship with small wild felines around agricultural settlements that may not map neatly onto the later domestic cat lineage familiar today. Archaeological finds from Neolithic sites have suggested complex interactions between humans and local cat-like predators drawn to rodent-rich farming environments. Scholars still debate whether these animals represent early commensal relationships involving leopard cats or other local species rather than direct ancestors of the modern domestic cat. This is a reminder that the cat's path into human life may not be a single straight line everywhere. Similar ecological pressures can produce similar relationships with related animals even before the now dominant domestic lineage fully arrives. Whatever the complexities of those early stages, by historical times cats are clearly established in China and increasingly woven into domestic, literary, and visual culture. Chinese households value them for pest control, especially where grain, silk, paper, and food storage need protection. In a civilization of large agrarian systems, dense urban life, and enormous archival and textile production, an animal that kills mice efficiently is no minor asset. Yet as in other parts of the world, utility quickly acquires aesthetic and symbolic companions. Cats begin to appear in painting, poetry, and decorative arts, often associated with elegance, stillness, leisure, or seasonal domestic calm. Their image in Chinese art can feel strikingly serene, a cat beneath flowers, near a garden rock, beside a resting scholar's world of ink and paper. The old hunter has not disappeared, but it has entered a new visual atmosphere. There is also a linguistic and symbolic subtlety in East Asian cat culture that reveals how thoroughly the animal can integrate into local meaning. In Chinese visual traditions, cats may be paired with butterflies, flowers, or other motifs carrying auspicious implications, sometimes through puns or homophones linking the image to wishes for longevity or good fortune. These associations vary by period and context, but they show that the cat can become more than a mouser without losing its domestic reality. It can sit inside systems of refined symbolism while still doing practical work under the table or behind the wall. Japan develops one of the most recognizable feline cultures in the world, though here too the story is layered and gradual. Cats likely arrive through continental connections, perhaps via China and Korea, and are initially valued in part for protecting precious manuscripts, sutras, and other stored materials from rodents. This is a fitting route for the species not just guarding grain now, but guarding writing. A small hunter that once defended the earlier stores of cereal now helps defend the written record of Buddhist and courtly civilization. Over time, cats move from elite and temple contexts into broader domestic life. They become companions, symbols, and eventually protagonists of folklore, visual culture, and later commerce in ways almost unmatched elsewhere. Japanese tradition is especially revealing because it preserves both warmth and uncanniness at once. Cats can be beloved household presences, admired for grace and charm. They can also become strange in folklore shape-shifting, uncanny, morally ambiguous, associated with age, transformation, and the eerie persistence of animal intelligence. The Bakaneko and Nekomata traditions are famous examples of this imaginative tension. These supernatural cat figures do not mean ordinary cats are hated. Quite the opposite. They suggest intense familiarity, the kind of intimacy that allows an animal's quirks to become mythic. A creature that lives in the house, watches silently, moves at night, and seems to understand more than it should is almost inviting supernatural elaboration. Japan, perhaps more than most places, turns that elaboration into a durable cultural art. And yet Japan also produces one of the gentlest and most enduring feline symbols, the beckoning cat, or maneki neko, later associated with luck, prosperity, and welcome. The historical origins of this figure are more recent than many assume, developing in early modern contexts rather than deep antiquity. But its popularity reveals something important. The cat in Japan comes to embody not just mystery, but attraction. It invites fortune inward. It belongs in shops, thresholds, and the small theatre of everyday hope. Few animals travel so easily between folklore, commerce, and affection. Southeast Asia adds another layer still. Through Indian Ocean and South China Sea routes, cats enter port cities, monasteries, royal courts, villages, and island settlements. In places such as Siam, later Thailand, cats acquire notable prestige and eventually become associated with specific local lineages and breeds, including the ancestors of what much later become famous pedigree forms in Europe and North America. Manuscript traditions from the region, especially cat books associated with Siamese court culture, suggest that certain feline appearances are linked to luck, status, or auspicious qualities. This is a fascinating shift. The cat is no longer only a practical hunter or an object of broad cultural affection. It is becoming a subject of classification, omen, and selective valuation based on appearance. Across Asia, then, the cat enters a world of regional reinvention. In one place it protects scripture. In another it sits in poetry beside flowers. In another it becomes a comic trickster, an uncanny spirit, a bringer of luck, or a creature of courtly distinction. What unites these roles is the basic stability of the animal beneath them. It is still the same old predator shaped by silence, precision, and selective sociability. But because it is adaptable without being easily remade, people can project different meanings onto it without destroying its usefulness. This is also the stage when local populations begin contributing more noticeably to the later diversity of named cat types, not yet in the strict Victorian pedigree sense, but through geographic isolation, cultural preference, and long household familiarity. Certain regional looks and reputations emerge: climate, chance, and human taste all matter. A cat favoured in one court for coat pattern or eye colour may be preserved more carefully. A local population on an island or in a port city may drift in appearance. The evidence for many early breed histories is murky and often wrapped in later romantic invention. But what survives in the record suggests that Asia plays a central role in the eventual visual variety modern cat enthusiasts celebrate. There is one more quiet transformation here. In much of Asia, as in the Islamic world, the cat often seems to settle not into absolute ownership but into gradations of belonging. Temple cats, shop cats, port cats, court cats, village cats, household cats, all occupy different distances from human control. This flexibility may be one reason the species integrate so successfully. It can serve highly ordered settings without ever requiring the total discipline expected of some other domestic animals. It can be elegant in a painting, useful in a granary, strange in folklore, and half-free in a courtyard, all without contradiction. By the close of this long eastward movement, the cat has become not merely a companion of one civilization or one religious world, but a nearly universal participant in settled life across Eurasia and its connected seas. It has acquired local names, local legends, local looks, and local moods. It belongs to scripture rooms and fishing ports, scholar gardens and market alleys, monasteries and merchant ships. It is stroked, fed, laughed at, painted, feared, blessed, and mythologized. Yet through all that variety, the core remains recognizable as small predator entering human worlds by means of usefulness, then staying because usefulness is never the whole story. Once cats master the old worlds of farms, ports, temples, and cities, they follow humans into something even larger and more disruptive, the age of oceanic expansion. This is the moment when the cat stops being mainly an animal of Afro-Eurasian civilization and becomes a near-global fellow traveller of empire, commerce, and colonization. The same traits that once drew wild cats to village grain stores now place their descendants aboard caravels, merchantmen, galleons, naval vessels, fishing boats, and colonial supply ships moving across the Atlantic, around Africa, into the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific, and toward remote islands that have never known a predator quite like this. The cat is no conqueror in the human sense. It does not claim land, issue orders, or raise flags. But it arrives wherever ships unload grain, cloth, tools, people, livestock, and fear. And once it arrives, the consequences can be intimate, practical, and ecological all at once. For sailors, the logic is ancient and immediate. A ship packed with provisions is a floating invitation to rodents. Mice and rats do not merely consume food, they foul stores, chew ropes, damage sails and leather, and threaten the long-term survival of any crew depending on fragile supplies. On a voyage lasting weeks or months, a good mouser can be as welcome as a cooper or navigator. The maritime cat is therefore both worker and morale figure. It serves below deck, in cargo holds, near biscuit stores and galley corners, moving through spaces humans cannot easily police at all hours. But it also becomes part of shipboard life in a more personal sense. Sailors, who live under relentless strain, superstition, boredom, and danger, often form attachments to the animals that share their confined world. A cat on a ship can become mascot, omen, comfort, or companion, even if its official job is to kill. Many later stories about famous ship cats are difficult to verify in detail, and maritime folklore has a habit of enlarging every useful creature into legend. Still, the broad pattern is secure. Cats are common enough aboard ships for them to become embedded in sailors' customs and beliefs. In some traditions, they are thought to predict weather, bring luck, or sense coming storms. In others, a ship's cat is simply regarded as a necessary part of the vessel's health. Whether the superstitions are old, local, or embellished later, they reveal the same truth. People at sea come to trust cats not only because they work, but because they endure the same uncertain passage. With the expansion of European maritime empires from the 15th century onward, this old shipboard logic suddenly operates at an enormous scale. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, French, and other vessels connect continents more regularly and more violently than ever before. They carry not only cargo and crew, but entire mobile ecologies. Horses, pigs, cattle, goats, weeds, microbes, insects, and rats all move with empire. Cats are part of this great biological upheaval. Their spread is rarely the headline in histories of colonization, but it's woven deeply into its practical fabric. Forts need stores protected. Plantation settlements need granaries guarded. Port towns need warehouses defended. Ships crossing dangerous distances need provisions secured. At every stage, the cat's old usefulness gives it passage. In the Americas, this movement transforms the cat's range dramatically. Pre-Columbian societies have rich and varied relationships with native felines, from jaguars and pumas to smaller wildcats, but not with the old-world domestic cat in the form familiar across Eurasia and North Africa. That changes with European arrival. Domestic cats accompany colonists, merchants, priests, soldiers, and settlers, appearing in port towns, mission stations, farms, and households built within colonial systems. They become part of the imported domestic order, one more creature woven into the remaking of landscapes and daily life in Spanish America, Portuguese Brazil, French territories, British colonies, and beyond. The cat gradually takes up its now familiar role around food storage, homes, docks, and later urban streets. This is not a glamorous expansion. It is domestic, incremental, and deeply entangled with the wider violence of colonization. The same is true in many island worlds. Here the cat's history becomes especially troubling. Islands often evolve in ecological isolation, producing birds, reptiles, and small mammals that have never faced a stealth predator of this kind. Some nest on the ground. Some have reduced fear responses. Some occupy tiny ranges with no room to retreat. A cat introduced to protect stores or accompany a settlement can quickly discover easier prey than rats. Eggs, chicks, small adults, endemic reptiles, all become vulnerable. Over generations, the results can be devastating. On islands in the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Pacific, and elsewhere, introduced cats contribute to local declines and extinctions, sometimes alone, more often alongside rats, habitat destruction, pigs, goats, and other colonial introductions. What makes the cat so effective in the house and granary makes it brutally effective in ecologies that did not evolve with anything similar. This is one of the hardest contradictions in the history of cats. The same animal that protects human food stores can help destroy irreplaceable non-human life. There is no villainy in the animal itself. It is doing exactly what evolution built it to do. The problem lies in human movement and human carelessness. Yet that distinction does not soften the consequences. On many islands, the arrival of cats becomes part of a wider ecological unmaking that scholars are still tracing in detail. Archaeology, historical ecology, and conservation biology together show how often colonial settlement rearranges predator-prey relationships in ways that native species cannot survive. Cats do not act alone, but they are among the most efficient agents in the process. Australia and New Zealand later become especially stark examples of this dynamic, though with important differences in timing and context. Domestic cats arrive with European settlement, first in ports and camps, then in wider colonial landscapes. Some remain tied to households and farms. Others escape or are released, forming feral populations capable of surviving in extraordinary conditions. In ecosystems full of small marsupials, ground-nesting birds, reptiles, and other vulnerable fauna, the impact is profound. Modern conservation science has documented this in grim detail, though the full historical pattern is still being reconstructed region by region. What survives in the record suggests that once cats detach from household dependence and establish free breeding populations, they can become one of the most consequential invasive predators on Earth. And yet for human beings in colonial and maritime worlds, cats remain beloved at the same time. That is the tension again. In port cities from Havana to Cape Town, from Batavia to Calcutta, from Manila to Lisbon, cats inhabit docks, warehouses, kitchens, taverns, and domestic courtyards. They become part of the visual language of empire at ground level, though rarely at the level official histories prefer to narrate. A governor's palace may have its cats. So may the slave ship's dockside storehouse, the plantation kitchen yard, the missionary compound, the sailor's hammock corner, the merchant's counting room, and the alley behind a fish market. The cat belongs to all these worlds, crossing class lines more easily than many other domestic animals because its usefulness is universal and its maintenance cheap. Maritime culture in particular gives the cat an enduring mythology. A ship's cat is often imagined as independent yet loyal to the vessel, weather-wise, adaptable, and unsentimental, which is not far from how sailors like to imagine themselves. Paintings, memoirs, oral traditions, and later nostalgic writing preserve these figures, though often with embellishment. Some cats become name presences remembered by crews. Others vanish into the anonymous labour that kept ships functioning. But the memory persists because the fit is so perfect. A ship is a human system always on the edge of disorder. The cat is a small manager of disorder. Its old village role scales naturally into the global age. Colonial households also help spread cats inland. Once settlements stabilise, cats reproduce locally, move between homes, and become fixtures of barns, mills, inns, urban markets, and plantation compounds. Children grow up with them. Local naming traditions attach to them. In some places they interbreed widely without human supervision, producing semi-feral populations around towns and farms. In others, certain colours or temperaments are preferred. The line between ship cat, dock cat, house cat, and street cat remains fluid. This fluidity is one of the great engines of feline success. Cats do not need intensive breeding programs or centralized distribution to spread. Human settlement does most of the work for them. There is also a quieter cultural transformation underway. As cats become part of colonial societies across the globe, they begin entering the domestic emotional world of the early modern and modern household in new ways, not everywhere at once, and not uniformly across class or region, but increasingly they are not just tolerated workers. They are companions, amusements, creatures given names and remembered individually. This shift is easier to detect in later centuries when letters, portraits, diaries, and household records become more abundant, but its roots likely deepen during the expansionary age. Once a cat lives not only in the granary but in the room. Once it is no longer merely present but familiar to the intimate life of a family, a different history begins opening. Still, the global spread of cats cannot be told honestly as a charming maritime adventure. It is inseparable from colonization and its ecological aftermath. Cats ride the same ships that carry conquest, disease, forced labor, and environmental disruption. They enter island worlds already under pressure and add a new layer of predation. They accompany human settlement into places where native species have no answer to such hunters. This does not make the cat morally suspect. It makes its history morally entangled. The animal's success is bound to the success of human expansion, and human expansion leaves both cities and extinctions in its wake. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the domestic cat is firmly established across much of the inhabited globe. There are still regions where density is lower, conditions harsher, or formal recognition slower. But the broad transformation is complete. From one end of empire to another, cats are on ships, in ports, in farmyards, in colonial capitals, in frontier posts, and increasingly in ordinary homes. They are still doing the same ancient work catching what steals from human stores, but now they are doing it on a planetary stage. This chapter of the cat's history is therefore one of scale, contradiction, and unintended power. The old hunter that once approached Neolithic grain stores now crosses oceans and reshapes ecosystems. It comforts sailors, protects cargo, charms children, and devastates island birds. It becomes a symbol of domestic familiarity in places where it is also a deeply foreign arrival. Few animals embody so clearly the double edge of human mobility. The cat travels because people need it. The world changes because it comes, and once again, the animal itself remains what it has always been: silent, efficient, selective, taking the niche offered and filling it with almost unnerving perfection. For most of their history with humans, cats are not designed in the way many other domestic animals are designed. They are not systematically reshaped for speed like horses, for milk like cattle, for wool like sheep, or for guarding and obedience like many dogs. They arrive in human society already so well adapted to their basic role that people can live beside them for thousands of years without feeling much need to alter them. A cat that catches mice, survives harsh conditions, raises kittens in a corner of the barn, and occasionally chooses a place by the fire is already doing the job. This is why the deep history of cats feels so continuous. Ancient Egyptian cats, Roman warehouse cats, medieval monastery cats, Ottoman market cats, and colonial ship cats differ in context more than in form. The great physical reinvention of the cat comes late, and when it comes, it says as much about changing human taste as it does about the animal itself. That late transformation begins to gather force in the 18th and especially 19th centuries, when urbanization, bourgeois domestic life, imperial collecting habits, natural history, and new ideas about classification all converge. This is the age in which European and American societies become increasingly interested in sorting living things into named types, displaying them, comparing them, standardizing them, and claiming expertise over them. Plants, dogs, pigeons, poultry, and ornamental animals all enter systems of organized breeding and exhibition. The cat, long treated as useful, familiar, and only lightly managed, is gradually drawn into the same world. It does not happen overnight. Many people still think of cats as semi-independent household creatures rather than crafted domestic stock. But once the logic of breed culture touches the cat, its modern image begins to change. Victorian Britain is central to this shift. It is not the only place where people notice differences among cats. admire unusual coats, or prefer certain local types. Such preferences are much older and more widespread, but Victorian culture gives those preferences institutions. Cat fanciers begin collecting, describing, naming, ranking, and exhibiting distinct forms. The cat show emerges. Breed standards are proposed. Clubs are organised. The animal moves from hearth and stable toward the display hall. What had long been a practical companion becomes, increasingly, an object of aesthetic curation. This tells us something important about the 19th century. It is an age fascinated by taxonomy, improvement, and visible refinement. The Victorians do not merely want animals that work. They want animals that signify taste, rarity, exotic origin, or controlled beauty. The cat fits this new desire surprisingly well because it already carries an aura of elegance and mystery. A long-haired cat from Persia, a sleek blue-coated cat from a northern port, a colour-pointed cat linked to Siam, all can be imagined not simply as Mausers but as embodiments of place, distinction, and cultivated preference. The cat, once valued for what it removes from the house, is now also valued for how it looks inside it. The role of empire is impossible to ignore here. By the 19th century, European imperial reach exposes collectors and breeders to animal populations from many regions, though often through unreliable stories, romantic exaggerations, and selective importation. Cats said to come from Persia, Siam, Russia, Turkey, or elsewhere, gather prestige not only because of actual traits, but because distant origin itself becomes marketable. The evidence behind many breed origin stories is notoriously murky. Later fanciers often construct neat lineages out of fragmentary imports, hearsay, and wishful branding. Scholars still debate the true development of several famous breeds, and no single explanation fully accounts for the gap between breed mythology and genetic reality. What survives in the record suggests a mixture of genuine regional ancestry and heavy later reconstruction. The Persian is perhaps the clearest example of how history and fantasy intertwine. Long-haired cats certainly exist in southwest and Central Asian zones, before the Victorian cat fancy builds its modern categories, and European travellers notice and admire them. Yet the Persian, as later standardised, is not a simple preserved ancient type, carried intact into modernity. It is a product of selection, fashion, and breed refinement, shaped over time by what fanciers decide the cat ought to look like. The same is true in different ways for the Angora, a name associated with cats linked to Ankara and long-haired Eastern types more broadly. These labels tell partial truths, but they also conceal the extent to which modern breeds are human-made narratives imposed on fluid populations. The Siamese offers another revealing case. Cats from Siam, later Thailand, do appear in regional manuscript traditions and historical references, and their striking colour point pattern makes them instantly distinctive to foreign observers. When they enter British and European breeding circles in the 19th century, they're received not merely as animals but as exotica elegant, unusual, aristocratic, and faintly mysterious. Over time, however, the breed known as Siamese is shaped heavily by selective breeding preferences in the West, producing forms that diverge from earlier local types. Once again, what people celebrate as authenticity often turns out to be a hybrid of regional inheritance and modern aesthetic editing. Cat shows institutionalize these processes. The first organised exhibitions transform the way cats are seen in public. A cat can now be judged not only by its effectiveness or temperament, but by conformity to written standards of coat, body shape, ear placement, tail length, eye colour, and general impression. This is a radical change in human attention. For thousands of years, a cat's value lies in behavior first and appearance second. Now, appearance can dominate. The animal is measured against an ideal, and that ideal is increasingly detached from the rough ecological life that originally made cats valuable at all. This shift has consequences both charming and troubling. On one hand, the formal cat fancy preserves and celebrates remarkable visual diversity. It encourages people to notice subtle differences in coat texture, pattern, proportion, and expression. It produces records, clubs, and lineages that make cat history easier to trace in some respects. It deepens human attachment by turning cats into admired individuals rather than background workers. On the other hand, selective breeding introduces familiar domestic dangers, narrowing gene pools, exaggerating physical traits, and rewarding aesthetics that can compromise health. The evidence becomes especially clear in some modern pedigrees, where flattened faces, extreme body forms, or hereditary disorders reflect the old domestic paradox of human preference outrunning biological wisdom. What makes cat breeding especially interesting is how partial the transformation remains. Even in the heyday of the fancy, most cats in the world are not pedigreed exhibition animals. They are ordinary domestic cats breeding with minimal oversight in villages, farms, docks, alleyways, and neighborhoods across the globe. This is still true today. The vast majority of cats belong not to neatly registered bloodlines, but to the broad, resilient population often called domestic shorthairs or longhairs, shaped by local conditions, chance mating, and the loose human tolerance that has always defined much of feline history. The fancy, for all its visibility, represents only a thin and highly artificial layer placed over a much older and larger reality. This is one reason cats never become as thoroughly standardized as many dog breeds. Their domestication remains lighter, their free breeding populations more extensive, and their utility less tied to specialized human tasks. A dog bred for herding, pointing, retrieving, racing, or guarding can be shaped intensely around function. A cat's primary historical function is simpler and more universal: kill small pests. Beyond that, it has always retained more room to remain itself. Even when humans breed for beauty, they are working with an animal that resists deep manipulation in certain ways. The old feline autonomy persists beneath the ribbons and registration papers. There is also a social shift underlying this chapter. As industrialization advances, more people live in urban homes separated from direct agricultural labor. In such settings, the cat's role as working mouser does not vanish, but it begins competing with or giving way to companionship. A middle-class family in a city may keep a cat partly for vermin control, but also for pleasure, decoration, and emotional life. The domestic interior becomes more sentimental in the 19th century, more invested in private comfort, childhood, affection, and moral feeling. The cat enters that world successfully because it is small, clean, visually appealing, and adaptable to indoor living in a way many other animals are not. At the same time, the cat's reputation benefits from contrast with the dog. Dogs are often celebrated for loyalty, service, and trainability. Cats, by contrast, come to symbolize wit, refinement, independence, and selective affection. These traits suit certain modern sensibilities very well. The cat is increasingly valued not despite its reserve, but because of it. To win a cat's attention feels earned. To share space with a creature that seems to preserve its own inner life becomes part of the appeal. The Victorian and later modern cat is therefore not only bred into visual types, It is also culturally reimagined into a different kind of companion animal, one that fits changing ideals of home and personality. Lesser-known early cat fanciers help shape this modern image in surprisingly powerful ways. Figures such as Harrison Weir in Britain worked to codify breeds, organise shows, and popularise the idea that cats deserve the same serious attention previously given to dogs and pigeons. Their efforts can seem quaint now, but they alter the status of the species. Once a cat can win prizes, appear in specialised books, and be judged as a refined domestic specimen, it has entered a new phase of social recognition. It is no longer merely the quiet hunter under the chair. It is a subject of expertise, admiration, competition, and commerce. Yet even as this happens, the contradiction deepens. The more people breed cats for looks, the more visible becomes the divide between the curated cat and the ordinary one. Outside the show hall, countless anonymous cats continue living the old life in back alleys, farms, ports, and kitchens. They breed freely, maintain broad genetic diversity, and do the unglamorous work their ancestors have always done. The polished Persian on a velvet cushion and the scarred dock cat behind a fish stall are members of the same broad species, separated less by deep biological destiny than by human attention and classed environments. This chapter, then, is not the story of humans finally mastering the cat. It is the story of humans trying to turn an ancient, semi-autonomous commensal predator into an object of classification and aesthetic control, while never quite succeeding completely. Cats can be bred, registered, and displayed, but they are not remade from the ground up. The wild architecture of their behaviour and body remains stubbornly present. Even the most pampered pedigree kitten still stalks, pounces, grooms obsessively, and stares into corners as if listening to a world the household cannot hear. So the rise of the modern cat fancy marks a real turning point, but not an absolute one. It gives the cat new forms of prestige and new risks. It transforms some lineages into artifacts of taste. It moves the species more deeply into the emotional and decorative life of modern homes. But the deeper history continues underneath. The cat was never created by the show bench. It was only rearranged there. Beneath the certificates, titles, and idealized pedigrees remains the same old hunter from the settlement edge, altered in coat and contour perhaps, but never entirely persuaded to become anything less than feline. For thousands of years, people live beside cats without fully understanding what kind of domestic animal they have made. They know the daily facts. Cats catch mice. They breed quickly. They can become affectionate, but not reliably obedient. They remain half attached to human households and half capable of walking away from them. They look domesticated, yet never seem as transformed as cattle, horses, or many dogs. This ambiguity lingers well into the modern scientific age. The cat is familiar everywhere, but its history remains oddly blurred, only in the last century and especially in recent decades. Do archaeology, genetics, zoology, and evolutionary biology begin to illuminate the deeper pattern? What they reveal is both simpler and stranger than many people expected. The domestic cat is indeed a domestic animal, but one shaped far more lightly by human control than most of its household companions. One of the most important scientific findings concerns origin. For a long time, popular imagination and scattered historical references encouraged multiple dramatic possibilities. Perhaps cats are domesticated in several places independently. Perhaps Egyptian temple culture creates the domestic cat in its final form. Perhaps Europe or Asia produces key lineages separately. Modern genetic work has clarified much of this picture, even if some details remain debated. the evidence strongly indicates that the primary ancestry of the modern domestic cat lies in the Near Eastern and North African wildcat complex, especially populations closely related to the African wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica. In other words, the cats of the world are not descended from Egyptian temple cats alone, nor from a chaotic jumble of unrelated local wild species domesticated everywhere. Their roots trace back mainly to a narrower ancestral group that first enters sustained commensal relationship with human agricultural communities in the ancient Near East. This finding matters because it confirms something the historical record had long suggested but not fully proven. The first decisive stage of cat domestication is tied not to deliberate breeding for companionship, but to the ecological revolution created by farming. Genetics supports the view that cats are drawn into human life by grain, rodents, and settlement, then gradually spread outward with people. Egypt remains hugely important, especially for cultural elevation and later dispersal, but the cat's deeper domestic origin begins earlier and farther east. Science, in this case, restores the quiet first villages to the center of the story. Ancient DNA studies have added still more texture. By comparing genetic material from cat remains across archaeological sites and time periods, researchers have shown that multiple waves of dispersal occur. One broad lineage associated with early Near Eastern domestication spreads outward with Neolithic farming communities. Later, Egyptian cats appear to contribute strongly to subsequent expansions through the Mediterranean and beyond, especially as maritime trade intensifies. This is a subtle but crucial point. The domestic cat is not the result of a single frozen event. It is the result of an initial domestication followed by later mixing and expansion, with Egyptian-associated populations helping amplify the cat's reach. No single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern, and the evidence remains incomplete in some areas, but the broad outline is now much firmer than it once was. At the same time, science has complicated the story in helpful ways. Archaeology in East Asia, for instance, has suggested that in some early farming contexts, humans may have lived alongside local small felines such as leopard cats, attracted by similar rodent-rich conditions. These animals appear to have participated in temporary or local commensal relationships without becoming the main ancestors of the global domestic cat. This is one of the more surprising details in recent research. It suggests that the ecological logic of cat-human coexistence can emerge more than once with related species, even if only one lineage ultimately becomes the dominant domestic form worldwide. Human settlement creates repeated invitations. Different felines may answer, but not all of them remain in the domestic story. If genetics clarifies where cats come from, it also explains why they remain so close to their wild ancestors. Compared with many other domestic animals, cats show relatively modest genetic divergence from ancestral wild forms. This does not mean domestication is unreal or superficial. Domestic cats differ in behavior, social tolerance, coat variation, and some physiological traits. But the degree of human reshaping is limited compared with species subjected to intense artificial selection over millennia. A domestic cat can still look, move, hunt, and in some cases survive very much like a wild cat. In fact, feral domestic cats and wildcat populations can create serious conservation challenges because they are capable of interbreeding in some regions, threatening the genetic integrity of true wildcat lineages. This is one of the paradoxes modern science has made impossible to ignore. The domestic cat is both domesticated and not fully separated from the wild. It occupies an evolutionary middle ground. Dogs have been bent much more dramatically around human needs. Cattle and horses have been transformed through tightly controlled breeding and labour demands. Cats, by contrast, have largely retained the old predators' equipment. Their brains, bodies, hunting strategies, and sensory systems remain deeply conservative. Even coat colours and patterns, which vary widely under domestic conditions, often reflect changes at the surface more than a total restructuring of the animal beneath. Behavioural science reinforces this impression. Domestic cats show increased social flexibility compared with solitary wild ancestors, especially in environments where food is abundant and human tolerance is high. They can form colonies, they can bond with humans, they can learn routines, signals, and even some forms of training more effectively than older stereotypes suggest. But they do not become group-oriented in the same way dogs do. Their cooperation remains conditional, their attachment styles varied, their territorial instincts strong. A domestic cat may love a human household deeply and still preserve behavioural patterns that seem ancient and private. Scientists studying feline cognition and social behaviour often emphasise this point. Cats are neither cold automatons nor furry little people. They are a lightly domesticated predator negotiating life in human environments. The famous question of whether cats domesticated themselves is helpful here, though it can be oversimplified. In a broad ecological sense, yes, cats are not captured and remade by humans in the way some domestic species are. They move toward people because people create prey-rich habitats. Tolerant individuals thrive. Humans then reinforce that process through feeding, carrying, and eventually selective breeding. But self-domestication does not mean humans are irrelevant. Without human settlements, grain, ships, ports, and emotional investment, the domestic cat would never become a global species. It is better to think of cat domestication as an unusually loose partnership in which both parties shape the outcome, though not with equal intention. Science has also clarified the dietary truth behind the cat's historical continuity. Cats remain obligate carnivores, meaning their physiology still depends on nutrients most efficiently obtained from animal tissue. This is not a quaint inheritance. It is central to their identity as predators. Their digestive systems, teeth, and metabolic needs all reflect this long specialization. Modern pet food can obscure the reality because the kill is hidden inside processed packaging. But biologically, the cat remains a flesh eater in a way many household animals are not. This helps explain why the cat's ancient hunting behaviors endure so strongly even in well-fed domestic life. A creature built around animal prey never entirely forgets what it is for. Archaeology adds smaller, vivid details to this scientific picture. Cut marks, burial contexts, isotopic signatures, bone distributions, and settlement patterns all help reconstruct how cats lived near people. In some places they are buried carefully. In others they appear in refuse layers that suggest more ordinary coexistence. Stable isotope studies can sometimes hint at diets shaped partly by human environments. Pathologies can reveal injuries survived under possible human tolerance or care. Each line of evidence is partial, but together they show the same pattern. Cats live close enough to human settlements for their lives to change, yet not so tightly controlled that every cat becomes a managed possession. The relationship remains flexible, opportunistic, and variable from one place to another. A lesser-known but important scientific insight is how little of the domestic cat's diversity corresponds to ancient deep breed history. Many famous breeds are quite recent and genetically narrow. The overwhelming bulk of cat diversity worldwide still sits in loosely managed local populations rather than in pedigree lines. This means that when people imagine ancient Persians, Siamese, or other name types stretching unchanged into remote antiquity, they are often mistaking cultural story for biological continuity. Local cat populations certainly had regional distinctions, but the strict breed categories familiar today are mostly modern inventions layered onto a much older, much messier feline background. Another modern field, conservation biology, has forced scientists to study domestic cats not only as companions, but as ecological actors. This research has sharpened public understanding of just how effective cats remain as predators. Even well-fed domestic cats may hunt. Feral populations can exert immense pressure on local wildlife. The old design has not faded. If anything, scientific monitoring has revealed how intact it remains. Camera traps, stomach content analysis, scat analysis, GPS tracking, and population studies all point in the same direction. The domestic cat is not a failed predator softened by civilization. It is a successful predator, granted unprecedented global access by civilization, and yet science has also made the cat more intimate in another sense. Research on cat communication, social signaling, stress behavior, purring, vocal adaptation, and human-cat attachment has challenged the stereotype that cats are inscrutable or emotionally thin. They are selective, yes, but highly responsive to context. They communicate through posture, scent, slow blinking, vocalization, rubbing, tail position, and routine. Many adjust their meows specifically in relation to humans. Some form strong and secure bonds with caregivers. The evidence remains nuanced, and not every cat behaves the same way. But modern studies show a species more socially flexible and emotionally legible than older caricatures allowed. In a strange way, then, science has confirmed both sides of the cat's old mystery. The cat is less transformed than people expected, still close to its wild roots, still carrying the predator almost intact, but it is also more adaptive to human social life than cynics assumed, capable of genuine bonds without surrendering its independence. It belongs neither to the fully conquered domestic world nor to the untouched wild one. It occupies the threshold between them with remarkable stability. That threshold position has defined its whole history. Now genetics and archaeology merely give it firmer language. What survives from all these scientific discoveries is not disenchantment, but a clearer kind of wonder. The domestic cat turns out not to be a lesser wildcat or a small dog in disguise. It is a unique domestic experiment, a species that slips into human civilization with minimal redesign, and then spreads across the globe while retaining so much of its original architecture. Its story is not one of total taming. It is one of mutual accommodation, repeated dispersal, selective tolerance, and astonishing evolutionary persistence. So when modern science looks inside the cat, down into molecules, bones, teeth, isotopes, and neural behavior, it finds something history had always half suspected. The animal on the windowsill is ancient in more than appearance. It is carrying a design refined long before the first cities, then only lightly rewritten by 10,000 years of human company. Beneath the domestic familiarity, the old wild precision remains, and that is why the cat's past feels so close to the present. In few other animals is the distance between origin and living form still so narrow. The modern cat lives inside one of the sharpest moral contradictions humans have ever created around an animal. It sleeps on beds, appears in family photographs, receives names, birthdays, veterinary care, insurance policies, memorials, and in some cases a level of emotional devotion once reserved for close kin. At the same time, in many parts of the world, it is one of the most efficient small predators moving through damaged ecosystems already strained by habitat loss, fragmentation, pollution, and invasive species. These two truths do not cancel each other out. They collide. The result is a debate that can become unusually heated because it is never only about biology. It is about love, guilt, responsibility, freedom, sentiment, urban life, and the uncomfortable fact that an animal can be both cherished and ecologically destructive without changing its nature at all. By now, the scientific evidence on predation is extensive enough that the broad outline is difficult to deny. Free-ranging domestic cats kill enormous numbers of small animals worldwide, including birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. The exact figures vary by study, region, method, and the relative contribution of owned outdoor cats versus feral and semi-feral populations. Scholars still debate some of the numbers and how best to model them, especially across different landscapes. But no single explanation removes the central point. In the wrong ecological context, and sometimes even in ordinary suburban or rural contexts, cats can exert serious pressure on wildlife. On islands, where many species evolved without equivalent predators, the consequences have often been catastrophic. On continents, the effects can be more diffuse, interacting with habitat loss, windows, vehicles, pesticides, and climate stress. But they remain real. The emotional difficulty begins with the fact that cats do not look like ecological problems when viewed one by one. A single house cat on a garden wall appears graceful, harmless, even vulnerable. It is small. It is familiar. It is an object of affection. Human beings are poor at intuiting cumulative ecological force when it arrives in charming packages. A cat hunting in a yard is easy to forgive in a way bulldozers or oil spills are not. Yet population-level effects do not care about human sentiment. Millions of such hunters distributed across urban, suburban, rural, and island environments can create persistent mortality pressures on already stressed local fauna. The old village predator, granted global range and human subsidy, becomes something evolution rarely produces naturally, a high-density mesopredator supported by another species. Human subsidy is the key phrase here. Wild predators are constrained by food availability, disease, competition, territorial conflict, and the costs of reproduction under natural limits. Domestic cats, even when free-ranging, often live under partially artificial conditions. They are fed by owners, by neighborhood generosity, by waste streams, or by organized colonies. They receive shelter near buildings. They may be vaccinated or treated medically. Their numbers in a given area can therefore exceed what a similar wild predator population might sustain on local prey alone. This makes ecological impact particularly hard to judge by intuition. A cat can look half domestic and half independent while benefiting from a support system that allows it to keep hunting without the usual natural breaks. The question of owned outdoor cats and truly feral cats quickly complicates everything. These are not the same populations, even if they blur at the edges. An owned cat allowed outdoors may spend much of its life inside, receive regular meals, and still kill birds or lizards opportunistically. A feral cat born outside human homes may depend heavily on hunting, scavenging, and colony feeding. Semi-feral and community cats occupy intermediate positions. Policy debates often become confused because people imagine one category while speaking about another. What survives in the scientific record suggests that both owned outdoor cats and feral populations matter. But feral and unmanaged free-breeding cats often pose the greatest sustained threat in sensitive wildlife areas. The problem is that public sympathy is often strongest precisely where management is hardest. One of the most contested responses is trap-neuter-return, often abbreviated TNR. Under this approach, free-roaming cats are trapped, sterilized, vaccinated when possible, and returned to their territory, where colony size is expected to stabilize or decline over time. Supporters argue that it is more humane than mass killing, can reduce reproduction, and fits the moral reality that many people will not accept lethal control of cats. Critics argue that returned cats continue killing wildlife. Colonies may be maintained indefinitely by feeding and abandonment, and the method often fails to reduce numbers fast enough in ecologically sensitive areas. The evidence remains complex and sometimes politically polarized. Some studies suggest TNR can reduce populations under certain conditions, especially when applied intensively and combined with adoption and prevention of abandonment. Others find weak results or continued ecological harm where colonies persist. No single solution satisfies both conservation urgency and public compassion. The conflict becomes starkest on islands and in habitats containing highly vulnerable endemic species. There, conservation managers may resort to fencing, exclusion zones, or lethal eradication campaigns. Such measures have, in some places, helped native species recover dramatically. Yet they are deeply controversial because they target an animal many people know only as a companion. A cat shot or trapped in the name of biodiversity can provoke public outrage even when the alternative is the probable disappearance of a bird, mammal, or reptile found nowhere else on Earth. This moral asymmetry is revealing. Humans tend to empathize more easily with the individual animal in front of them than with the statistical or less charismatic life being lost in the background. Conservation, by contrast, often has to think in populations, lineages, and extinction risk. The cat sits directly in the gap between these moral scales. Urban life adds another layer. In cities, cats often function as both companions and informal wildlife. They occupy alleys, parks, parking lots, industrial zones, campuses, markets, and apartment blocks. Some people feed them daily and recognize them individually. Others see them as nuisances, disease risks, or threats to songbirds and small urban fauna. Many municipal authorities oscillate between tolerance, sterilization programs, sporadic removal, and neglect. The old feline talent for living at the edge of human systems makes total control difficult. A city can ban feeding in one district and produce new colonies in another through abandonment, migration, and the sheer reproductive resilience of the species. Once again, the history of cats returns to that ancient intermediate zone not fully owned, not fully wild, but thriving in the margins humans create. Disease concerns sometimes intensify the modern argument. Cats can carry parasites and pathogens relevant to human and animal health, with toxoplasmosis often becoming the best-known example in public debate. The science here is important, but it is also frequently distorted by panic or oversimplification. Cats are indeed the definitive hosts for Toxoplasma gondii, and under some circumstances the parasite poses risks, particularly for pregnant women and certain wildlife species. Yet ordinary hygiene, indoor living, responsible litter handling, and broader environmental management all matter greatly to actual risk. As with predation, the problem is real, but the public conversation often swings between denial and exaggeration. The cat, because it is emotionally charged, rarely receives calm treatment. Responsible ownership therefore becomes a central modern concept. Keeping cats indoors or providing controlled outdoor access through enclosures and supervised time is increasingly recommended by many veterinarians, wildlife advocates, and animal welfare groups. Indoor life reduces predation, road deaths, disease exposure, poisonings, injuries, and conflicts with other animals. It also raises questions about welfare. because a predator confined without enrichment may develop stress or behavioral problems. But the practical answer to that is not simply release. It is better environmental design climbing structures, play, hunting simulation, window access, routine, and social sensitivity to the needs of the individual cat. In other words, modern humans are being asked to do something slightly new in the long history of cats. Not just tolerate the animal's nature, but actively manage it in ways that protect both the cat and the world outside the house. This is not always culturally easy. In many places, letting cats roam freely has long been considered normal, even humane. A cat outdoors is imagined as more natural, more fulfilled, more authentically feline. There is truth in the instinct behind that view. Cats are indeed animals of movement, scent, territory, and predatory engagement. Yet modern landscapes are not ancient village edges. They are full of roads, toxins, dense housing, invasive prey dynamics, and shrinking habitats. The evidence suggests that what once felt natural may no longer be responsible in many contexts. The cat has not changed much. The world around it has. There is another hidden contradiction here. Humans adore cats partly because they seem to preserve something wild. They are softer than their ancestors, perhaps, and more tolerant of human touch, but they still carry the old stealth, gaze, and sudden violence. That is part of their appeal. People admire the very predatory competence they later find troubling in conservation debates. The cat is loved because it is not fully remade into a compliant domestic toy. But an animal that keeps its ancestral hunting machinery cannot be expected to switch it off simply because human ethics have become complicated. The conflict, in that sense, is not the cat's failure. It is ours. We brought a lightly domesticated predator everywhere, and then acted surprised when it behaved like one. Modern policy arguments often expose wider political and class tensions too. Bird conservation groups, animal rescue volunteers, suburban pet owners, public health officials, indigenous land stewards, urban residents feeding colonies, and rural households with working barn cats may all approach the issue from different priorities and lived realities. One group sees biodiversity loss. Another sees abandoned animals failed by human negligence. Another sees overregulation of ordinary life. Another sees a welfare disaster in unmanaged colonies. These positions can harden into caricature quickly. Yet each contains some truth. Cats are suffering in many feral situations. Wildlife is suffering in many free-roaming cat situations. Responsible solutions require admitting both without turning either into propaganda. A lesser-known but important point is that cats themselves are often victims of the systems that make them ecological hazards. Abandonment, unsterilized ownership, uncontrolled breeding, and sentimental refusal to make difficult management decisions all contribute to the problem. The street colony may look like a natural urban feature, but it is usually a human-created condition. So are many of the most damaging invasions on islands and in sensitive habitats. The moral burden therefore belongs first to people. The cat remains what it has always been, an opportunistic, highly effective predator. The unprecedented density, distribution, and vulnerability context are what humans provide. Even so, the modern cat does not become less beloved under this scrutiny. If anything, the emotional bond often deepens. People who keep cats indoors, build elaborate enriched spaces, rescue strays, sponsor sterilization drives, or advocate for humane policy are expressing the same old attachment in new forms. The animal's intimacy with human life is stronger than ever, but intimacy now carries a wider radius of responsibility. To care for a cat responsibly in the modern world means caring not only for the individual creature, but for the ecological web into which it is released, or from which it is withheld. That is the uneasy balance of the present. The cat remains a masterpiece of ancient predatory design, living inside homes full of blankets, glass, electricity, and filtered water. It remains a beloved companion, and in many places an invasive force. It remains a comfort on lonely evenings and a serious threat to certain birds at dawn. No single explanation, no single policy, no simple moral pose resolves all of this. The contradiction is built into the very success of the species. Cats became global because they fit human civilization almost perfectly. Now they fit it so well that their presence reaches far beyond the household and into the fate of other lives we're only beginning to count properly. The modern age has not changed what cats are. It has merely revealed, more clearly than ever, the cost of bringing such an animal everywhere with us. For all the effort humans have made to classify cats, breed them, praise them, control them, blame them, sanctify them, and turn them into symbols, one fact remains stubbornly clear: the cat's greatest achievement is not that it changed us, or that we changed it, but that it entered nearly every layer of human life while preserving the impression that it still answers to older laws. This is why the species thrives so powerfully in the present. It is not only a household animal now, it is a global cultural force, a digital icon, a therapeutic presence, an urban survivor, a subject of science, a problem for conservation, an engine of commerce, and a creature onto which modern people continue projecting whatever they most want companionship to mean. Yet beneath all these new roles, the cat still carries the old arrangement of silence, patience, watchfulness, and selective trust that first drew it toward village granaries thousands of years ago. The modern world has not dissolved that inheritance. It has turned it into fascination. In cities, this fascination is especially visible. The cat is almost uncannily suited to urban life. It tolerates density better than many animals. It can live privately inside apartments, semi-publicly in courtyards, or precariously along the edges of alleys, rooftops, markets, construction sites, and parking lots. It fits modern architecture the way it once fit barns and ship holds. Window ledges, stairwells, fences, fire escapes, balconies, garden walls, warehouse rafters, and apartment corridors all become versions of older lookout points and hunting routes. A city, for a cat, is not merely human construction. It is layered territory full of heat, hiding places, scent signals, and opportunities for surveillance. Few animals have adapted so gracefully to the built world without ever seeming fully domesticated by it. At the same time, the cat's intimacy with indoor life has deepened to an extraordinary degree. In many countries it now rivals or surpasses the dog in popularity, especially in dense urban environments where smaller space, quieter habits, and relative independence make feline companionship easier to maintain. The modern cat lives in studio apartments, suburban homes, elderly households, shared flats, and high-rise towers. It accompanies people through loneliness, grief, illness, insomnia, and routine. It becomes part of daily ritual: the sound at the bedroom door before dawn, the wait at the foot of the bed, the animal on the keyboard, the sudden appearance in a beam of afternoon sun, the silent witness to work, heartbreak, and sleep. For many people, cats are not decorative additions to life. They are stabilizing presences, creatures whose habits create rhythm in a world otherwise full of abstraction and screens. And then, inevitably, the cat conquers the screens as well. If the 20th century turns cats into modern pets on an unprecedented scale, the 21st century turns them into one of the defining symbolic creatures of internet culture. This is not a trivial footnote. It reveals something deep about the match between feline behavior and modern forms of attention. Cats are visually legible in brief moments. They are expressive without needing translation. They can appear regal, absurd, serene, offended, tender, destructive, and unknowably strange in the span of seconds. Their movements are precise enough to be mesmerizing and erratic enough to be comic. They inhabit the border between dignity and ridiculousness with a perfection almost no other animal can sustain. The internet does not merely discover cats, it rediscovers, at global speed, why human beings have always found them impossible to ignore. Memes, videos, live streams, rescue accounts, breed forums, veterinary influencers, and entire economies of cat imagery build on this foundation. The animal that once spread through ports and granaries now spreads through bandwidth. It becomes a shorthand for mood, alienation, resistance, softness, irony, introversion, comfort, and chaos. This would be impossible if cats were not already embedded in human emotional life. The digital cat works because the domestic cat works. People recognize the sideways glance, the abrupt leap, the carefully chosen sleeping place, the offended stillness, the theatrical indifference, because they have lived with some version of it already. Even those without cats often feel they know them. That is how deeply the species has entered shared imagination. Modern science, medicine, and psychology add yet another layer. Cats are increasingly studied not only as biological organisms or invasive predators, but as companions affecting human well-being. People speak of the calming effect of purring, the comfort of routine care, the emotional structure pets provide during isolation or depression, and the strange relief of coexisting with an animal that asks for attention without demanding performance. Some of these claims are supported more strongly than others, and the evidence around pet-related health benefits can be complicated. Scholars still debate how best to measure psychological effects and avoid oversimplified conclusions. But what survives in the human record is clear enough. People feel accompanied by cats in a way that matters profoundly. This is especially striking because cats offer a different emotional contract than many other domestic animals. They are capable of affection, but often on terms that appear chosen rather than automatic. They do not flatter human beings continuously. They do not always come when called. They may leave the room for reasons of their own. And yet, when they settle beside a person, when they return night after night to the same lap or chair or bedside, the gesture carries unusual force. It feels less like obedience than consent. That difference may help explain why modern people, often weary of performance and pressure, find cats so compelling. The cat seems to preserve a private self while still offering company. In an age that often feels overexposed, that quality has become almost idealized. There is also a political and economic dimension to the modern cat's success. Entire industries now depend on feline popularity food, litter, veterinary care, insurance, toys, furniture, enclosures, tracking devices, pharmaceuticals, media content, rescue networks, grooming, breeding, and luxury accessories. The cat has become economically enormous while remaining physically small. This too is a remarkable historical outcome. An animal that first entered human life through accidental ecological opportunity now supports global markets built around affection, management, and identity. People do not merely own cats. They organize homes, purchases, routines, and social relationships around them. In some cases, they speak of themselves primarily through them. Yet for all this absorption into modern life, the cat never becomes fully transparent. That is perhaps the deepest secret of its continuing power. People understand dogs by reading action outward: wagging, barking, loyalty, work, response. Cats resist such easy readability. They are expressive, but not simplistically. They can seem intensely present and elsewhere at the same time. They look at blank corners. They vanish into impossible spaces. They sleep with total abandon, then wake as if from another century. They can be comic 1 hour and almost hieratic the next, as if some fragment of Temple Egypt, monastery shadow, shiphold, a Neolithic granary still passes through them. This is not mysticism. It is continuity. The cat remains legible enough to live with and strange enough to provoke endless interpretation. That continuity explains why cats still carry traces of every age they have crossed. In the modern pet lies the village hunter, the Egyptian emblem, the Roman mouser, the medieval threshold creature, the market cat of Cairo, the scholar's companion of East Asia, the ship cat of empire, the Victorian show specimen, the invasive island predator, the rescued alley survivor, and the viral icon glowing on a phone screen in the middle of the night. Few animals contain so much accumulated history without breaking into obvious fragments. The cat does not wear its past like costume. It simply continues being itself, and that self has moved through nearly the whole span of civilization. This is why the story of cats never really resolves into a neat lesson. They are not examples of perfect domestication. They're not symbols of pure freedom either. They do not prove that humans conquer nature, or that nature resists us untouched. They show something subtler and probably truer. Sometimes the most enduring partnerships are built not on total mastery, but on repeated negotiated advantage. Humans made worlds full of grain, walls, ships, warmth, books, ports, wires, and windows. Cats stepped into those worlds because mice did first. Then they stayed because something larger than utility began to grow. They gave us pest control, companionship, beauty, comedy, friction, responsibility, and an unnerving mirror of our desire to live closely with what we do not fully command. So today, whether on a farm, in a crowded apartment, in a temple courtyard, in a shelter cage, on a harbour wall, in a suburban window, or across millions of glowing screens, the cat remains what it has always been at heart, an ancient predator that found room inside human civilization without surrendering the old terms of its being. That may be why it still rules so much of human imagination, not because it became ours completely, but because, after all these thousands of years, it never did. In the end, the history of cats narrows again to something small: a body stepping through dusk, a pause at a threshold, a pair of eyes reflecting a light older than the house around them. Civilizations rise, store grain, build ships, paint gods, light candles, open ports, map oceans, wire continents, and fill the air with signals no wildcat could ever have imagined. The cat moves through all of it with almost unsettling continuity. It changes less than the worlds that welcome it. Perhaps that is why people keep looking at cats and feeling that history has folded strangely close. In them, the ancient past is not buried in ruins or locked behind museum glass. It sits on windowsills. It sleeps in laundry baskets. It listens at night. The old hunter from the reed beds and settlement walls is still here, softened by companionship but not erased by it, still carrying the fine machinery of patience, appetite, and alertness that first made its survival possible. And there is something humbling in that. Human beings built empires and religions and global markets, and one of our most enduring fellow travellers remains an animal that never fully accepted our script. It came near, accepted the bargain, and stayed just independent enough to remain itself. That distance, slight but permanent, may be the real source of its fascination. The cat is close enough to love and distant enough to wonder about. So the story ends where it began in Half-Light, with a creature shaped by silence, not vanished, not fully explained, not entirely ours, just present, as it has been for thousands of years, moving lightly through the rooms and ruins of human time.